Yeah, how is the sound now? Is it still double?
Sounds a little bit echoey, yes.
You might want to have this here.
Is this a sound through your laptop or through the room system?
It looks like it may be both.
How could that be?
But
And switch it off on one of them.
One of them does look like it's switched off now, so maybe just try to switch the other one on. And I think this is your laptop and maybe not the room. I'm not sure.
well, I think what's on is the room.
Oh, that sounds okay now,
Is that okay?
more or less.
Okay, by me.
Des Hogan says it's pretty good.
Okay, I sent the link to the YouTube recording for whoever needed to watch it
Great.
later.
So I apologize for the confusion. But we can now introduce Brian Copenhaver.
Thank you so much. And thanks for the invitation, Dan. Thanks to all of you for being here. By the time we're finished, I hope you'll have some idea what that strange picture is that you're seeing on the screen. So I'm going to talk about philosophy as Descartes found it, and particularly about picturing. Philosophy as Descartes left it was as he left it after 1637. Philosophy as Descartes found it was philosophy as he found it before.
Let me just see if
that Kingston with the sound. The room might sound. And if that be here, they here, then sometimes the room mic doesn't have to.
the room mic doesn't have to be.
I think maybe you would have
And if
to.
you tries to do that here, it goes there.
So
I
I
think
should.
maybe we wouldn't need to hear your sound at all. So
To Vanguard.
It's not the room mic.
We've got, beg your pardon?
Must be the
This microphone. This computer's not open, so I don't think it's. I can turn this computer off and then.
I don't know what it's.
well, now both of them are on the mics.
Yeah, I'm trying to.
Possible to just turn the mic off rather than just the mute button.
No, please. Okay, mute.
Okay, is this better?
Not really. Are you also getting sound from one of them? I think that might be the problem. There might be sound coming from one of the systems that's getting picked up.
Turn off the sounds.
Okay, how about now?
So far seems to go well.
Is it better now?
Yes.
Good.
It's good, but we can see your email folder. Oops.
Let me just figure out now how I can get this.
Would it actually be impossible to do the presentation on this computer that you're using right now? With Brian just standing where you are standing now? and ditch the second computer?
As long as I can see the what's on the screen well enough, and I could probably do that. Yeah.
Just trying to figure out how to get us back to where it is that we were before.
What do you mean, the slide?
Yeah,
Don't worry about that. I can do that. You just press you just use the arrow keys.
Doesn't seem to be as
Have to get into the PowerPoint and then just use the arrow keys.
Does anybody know how to get back to the main?
What do you mean? Get back to what?
Well, I just now have a little tiny square and I can't see
We
anything.
want to get it back into the main PowerPoint presentation.
Oh, we see you. Okay, I don't think we're seeing what you're seeing, so someone should come help you.
Dan, I suggest that you stop sharing your screen and then go back into sharing screen again, but this time click on the PowerPoint presentation and then start from beginning,
There we
and it
go.
should be fine.
There you go.
Okay, can you see it now?
No, it's not on the screen, but you've got it in front of you, so that's
It says you are sharing screen.
one step away.
Yeah, but you're sharing the Windows Explorer. When you share screen, you need to click on the PowerPoint window to bring that one up.
That's what I was doing, I thought.
Well, we can see your hard drive.
Yeah, no.
Yes, yes, that's it.
That's progress.
From beginning.
There we
Yes.
go.
Got it.
Now, so remember, the spirit of the hour is disruptive technologies. That's what we're all about. I'm going to talk about philosophy. Dan, this thing's going to have to go away because I can't see my word. Sometimes that little box go away.
Why don't you,
It's okay. I'll just watch it.
why don't you take your computer with which has got the text on it?
It's fine. No, this is good here.
Okay,
So I'm going to be talking. I'm sorry if I'm not looking at you. That's because I have to look at the screen. Philosophy as Descartes found it, in particular about picturing as he found it. So philosophy as Descartes left it. He left it after 1637. Philosophy as Descartes found it, he found before 1637. You could call that late medieval philosophy. You could call it Renaissance philosophy. Today, I'm going to be talking about it as philosophy technologized. Philosophy technologized, in particular, by the printing technology that was invented around 1450. Philosophy technologized. This comes from a book in 5 parts. 2 of the parts are polemics about the historiography of philosophy. 3 of the parts are historical accounts of Cartesian philosophy. One of those accounts is about meditation. One is about method. One is about explanatory picturing, and that's the one that I'm focused on today, explanatory picturing. Another way to approach this would be to think about paths to innovation in philosophy. So one such path was Cartesian method. Another such path was Cartesian meditation. And another such path is Cartesian picturing. And that's my topic. Cartesian picturing. Meditation, as Descartes found it before 1637, came from works by people who were pretty well known. Erasmus, the early Jesuits, Montaigne, and method, as Descartes found it, from people who were maybe slightly less well known. Agricola, Remus, Franco Borgersdijk, not a household name, Franco Borgersdijk. And then picturing, as Descartes found that these names probably aren't very well known at all to people who work on the history of philosophy. Condos, Maluti, as I say, those are names we'll be dealing with today. So for these strange names and odd pieces of terminology, the handout that I've distributed is pretty important. All these are on that handout. Descartes, according to me, wrote picture books. So one of my questions is, how were picture books made? And my answer, they were made by technologies. Another question, who read picture books? My answer, they were read by apoptic communities, read in apoptic communities. So what you might ask, might wonder is, apoptic community, what do I mean by that? Technologies and apoptic communities, as I understand it, were actually constituted features of modernity. The word apoptic comes from optes, which means watcher. Communities that are watching, spectating, looking, so on and so forth. Apoptic. But only picture books that were made by technologies could be seen in the apoptic way. And there were no such technologies in pre-modern times. There just weren't any. Some features of the apoptic experience. The experience was visual, it was shared, it was remote in space and time from its objects, and it was enhanced by technologies for contact with its objects. Apoptic experience, visual, shared, remote, and technologically enhanced. Pictorial technologies overcame the remoteness in space and time of objects experienced by apoptic seeing. That was the role of pictorial technologies. So here's an example of apoptic experience around 1950. For those of you with really deep memories, that's Annette and Fumicella. And I forgot the guy's name. Remember Ned? No. But that's a apoptic experience around 1950, driving movie theater. And this is apoptic experience also around 1950, a different kind of apoptic experience. Is something wrong?
It seems to complain about hearing here.
Can you speak a little bit louder, maybe?
Oh, talk louder? Can you hear me now? Is it better if I'm talking this loud?
Yes, there's a bit of an echo, but I guess there's not much we can do about that.
Okay. So there's a 1950 style apoptic experience. To make the technology even more complicated, I'm wearing brand new hearing aids, and when people of my age wear hearing aids, they tend to talk too softly. So forgive me. Apoptic experience around 1950. And here's some apoptic experience closer to our own time in 2022. So this, I think, gives you a pictorial sense of what I mean by apoptic experience. Apoptic experience is visual, it's shared, it's remote in space and time from its objects, and it's enhanced by technology. Those are its characteristics. Descartes wrote picture books as vehicles of apoptic experience and as products of printing technologies. He wrote picture books. Contemporaries of Descartes who shared the experience of reading his picture books belonged to groups that were Cartesian apoptic communities. Our world in 2022 is saturated with pictures. The world in 1950 was already a picture-rich world. The world in 1650 when Descartes died, was picture poor by comparison. And the world in 1450 had been all but pictureless. The world and the everyday experience for almost everyone was all but pictureless as of 1450. So quite some significant changes as far as my topic is concerned at these three levels of time, 1450, 1650, 1950, as the picturing. In the picture poor world of 1600, the apoptic experience of seeing pictures printed in books was still a novelty, and it was still a disruptive novelty. But, and this is crucial, the disruption was both constructive disruption and destructive disruption. Both ways, construction and the destruction, were powerful. Some examples we can see of disruptive pictures, and these are going to be pictures of skeletons, viscera, meaning human intestines, and the moon. Skeletons, viscera, and the moon. So this is a famous manuscript called the Arundel Psalter, which was made around the year 1300. And as you can see, there are skeletons in the picture. And the skeletons are shown in a way which is meant to shock the observer. The experience had is meant to be a destructive experience. That's the Arundel Psalter around 1300. Later, almost 2 centuries later, this is a woodcut by a physician named Michel in 1493, and it's a skeleton again. But this skeleton isn't meant to do anything, have a destructive effect. It's meant to have an instructive effect, and the instructive effect is informing, giving information. And you can tell that if you look at the picture. You can tell that because labels are attached to the skeleton, and those inform the viewer by naming parts of the body. This is a pretty significant step forward in scientific picturing. Now here's another skeleton, half a century after that, in 1543, by Vesalius. This skeleton is made, but also to explain. And the experience involved again is constructive experience. Instead of labels, what Vesalius is doing is using pictorial conventions of realism, which we're quite used to seeing every day. Pictorial conventions of realism to explain how parts of the body fit together. That's what Vesalius is up to with that picture of the skeleton. So if we compare these three images from 1300, from 1493 and 1543, you can see there's quite some dramatic change over this period of time. From Arundel to Alain, 200 years. From Alain to Vesalius, 50 years. And in that last 50 years, the change in the quality of the picturing is really enormous. As a matter of fact, I would say those images you just saw, there are no better examples than those images of progress in explanatory picturing over that 50 years before 1543. So what went on is that the technology enabled craftspeople to make every copy of the picture exactly the same. We can think of that as a certain kind of stability of information. The technology also enabled thousands of people to see identical copies, exactly identical copies. We can think of that as duplication. And when you put those two together, what you get is progress in the pictorial experience and the optic experience as a result of these accumulated improvements over time. Stability, duplication, leading to progress. In 1543, Vesalius made pictures and copied them in printed books. And he did this to improve on changes that had been introduced by Alain in 1493. Progress from stability and duplication were possible, however, only when pictures were reproduced in copies exactly alike to be seen by many readers of the printed books. It's only under those circumstances that the sort of progress that happened was possible, progress from stability and duplication. Later observers of pictures that were copied in 1543 were remote from the original skeleton that was pictured. They were remote from the original drawing, and they were remote from other observers of the copies. As duplication overcame remoteness, Coptic communities of readers observed progressive improvements that required stability in copy pictures. Now, here's a skull that Vesalius made in 1543. And if you look carefully at the skull, you can see that there are letters on it that mark parts of the skull and distinguish them from one another. And then if you flipped a couple of pages, what you would see is that those letters are keyed to names written elsewhere in the book, names of those parts of the skull. That's what Vesalius was doing in 1543. This is a later anatomist, about 75 years later. His name is Casseri, and again, it's a skull. And you can see it's the same sort of skull with some important differences. One difference is that about twice as many parts of the skull are labeled. And the reason that can happen is because of the progress that had taken place in the science of anatomy. Also, this picture, unlike the one you just saw, isn't the woodcut, it's an engraving. And so when you look at the skull, you perceive its detail as finer and actually, under conventions of realism, more realistic. The woodcut by Vesalius, which is the earlier one, labeled only about 20 skull sites. The engraving by Casseri, which is later, labeled twice as many skull sites. Progress by accumulation of stable pictorial information is what was going on. Progress by accumulation of stable pictorial information. So here are a couple of other skulls that we can look at. One is a skull from Pompeii, so it's very, very old. And the other is a much newer skull, as you can see. And both these skulls are meant to be disruptive. They're meant to have a negative effect on the viewer, but they're familiar. They're not disruptive because they're unfamiliar. They're familiar. These skulls by Vesalius and Casseri are also disruptive, but they're unfamiliar in one important respect. They're unfamiliar in new conventions of realism. They're unfamiliar as real or perhaps real seeming, right? Not just as scary, but as what skulls really look like. They were unfamiliar in that way, in that convention of realism. So to summarize these abstractions, I'm talking about pictorial disruptions, and I'm thinking about them on a plus to minus spectrum, so that one experience could be constructive, another could be destructive. If it's informative, it's constructive. If it's alarming, it's destructive. If it's explanatory, it's constructive. If it's shocking, it's destructive. And obviously, these aren't mutually exclusive categories. On both ends of the spectrum, the experiences are powerful, and they're powerful just because they're disruptive, but disruptive in different ways, positively so, and negatively so. The pictorial disruptions by Vesalius in 1543 of the skulls that he made, in my view, were predominantly constructive. Mainly what they were doing was providing information that was brand new in certain ways. His pictures of viscera, I think, are different in this regard. So there's a skull by Vesalius on the left. There's some viscera by Vesalius on the right. If you can imagine yourself in 1543 looking at this page of the book, you've never seen anything like this before. You're looking inside yourself and seeing all that biological gear inside yourself that you've never seen before. And you can see why that might be off-putting, alarming, shocking, for some people perhaps disgusting. So those are pictorial disruptions that are negative. Now here's a very different image. This is a picture of the moon by Galileo from 1610. It's a very famous picture. And it's a pictorial disruption. When Descartes was a teenager, many people who were remote from one another, they were remote from the moon, they were remote from Galileo's telescope, they were remote from Galileo's drawings. These people saw identical printed copies of his moon picture, and they had powerful optic experiences from looking at that picture. These pictures were destructive, both constructively and destructively. The Coptic communities in those days saw disruptive pictures showing that the heavens, like the earth, were imperfect. Heavens were supposed to be perfect, but they weren't. Galileo's picture showed that. Galileo's response to disruption from his telescope was to publish a starry messenger with wonderful news of a constructive disruption, news that was informative and explanatory. John Donne's response, the poet John Donne, just a year later, commenting on Galileo, John Donne's response was very different. His response famously, quote, "all coherence gone," unquote. When Donne saw Galileo's pictures, that was how he responded. What he saw was destructive disruption. Destructive because what he saw was physical, religious, and social disorder, all tangled up with one another. Disruptive, picturing of a constructive kind, according to Galileo, very same images of a destructive kind, according to John Donne. Galileo and Descartes, of course, were contemporaries. They both made picture books. They both used pictures to explain natural phenomena. To explain natural phenomena. The discourse in 1637, 78 pages long, no pictures in the discourse. However, the discourse is published together and bound with the optics, the meteorology, and geometry, same year, same book, 413 pages. Many, many, many pictures in those pages. Meditations, 1641, no pictures. Principia, 1644, many, many, many pictures. A stark difference. Descartes made picture books throughout his whole career. And the purpose of the pictures was usually, not always, but usually to explain. So, if that is correct, that might help to know what in general was picturing of this kind for. What were the purposes of picturing? I think there were four purposes for Cartesian picturing. One was explaining, that's the most important. One was illustrating, that was important also. And informing, and then decorating. Pictures could do all those things. Explain, illustrate, inform, and decorate. You can find them, all four of these in books by Descartes. The purpose of picturing, decorating, you can see in the Meditations, in the prefatory letter to the Sorbonne. So that's the first page of the first edition of the Meditations. And if you look at the top, you see the printer's ornament. And if you look a little further down, you see an ornamented capital with foliage. And those images, those pictures, they are pictures. And they have no other purpose than to decorate. That's all. Also in the Meditations, another purpose of picturing, informing, giving information. And you can see this on the title page of the Meditations. So that's the title page, again, the first edition. If you look in the middle, you see this rather elaborate picture, which has quite a few moving parts. If you come a little closer, what you'll see is that this picture is an image of a phoenix in flames, burning or phoenix in flames. And then over on the right, there's a Latin motto wrapped around the phoenix in flames. It says "Aeternitatis Soli." That word "soli" is a pun on Soli, which was the name of the printer. And then down at the bottom in words, you get Michel Soli at the sign of the phoenix, right? So information is being given to the reader. What's the information? It's the kind, nothing to do with philosophy, right? It's the kind that we call advertising. That's the kind of information. And that's what that picture does. So another purpose of illustrating the optics is illustrating. Sorry, purpose of picturing the optics, illustrating. And here, the illustrating is going to be a phrase that Descartes uses in the optics. The phrase is "a man freshly dead." A man freshly dead. So that's the man freshly dead. And if you look close, what you'll see is that his eye's missing. The eye's been taken out of his socket. And if you just see the picture by itself, all you get is, okay, that's a picture of a man freshly dead. I can use that. And if you saw it on the full page, right, that's what you would see. What Descartes wants you to know is that a thing like that, very, very abstract picture of an eye in the middle of the page, showing an even more abstract field of vision with optical information, where that came from was a human being. And that's what a man freshly dead looks like. It illustrates a man freshly dead. Another purpose of picturing was explaining. And pictures in the optics explain paths of light. So here are two pictures in the optics that explain paths of light. They're very different pictures, although they have the same purpose, explaining paths of light. Descartes used the word expliquer to explain 14 times in the optics. And he used it in association with pictures and applied it to pictures. But there's no doubt that what he meant to do in the optics was to explain with pictures, not just to decorate, not just to inform, not just to illustrate, but to explain. The stakes were higher. Some of the pictures in the optics, like part of this picture, they're concrete. And what they do is they explain by familiarizing. This technique of explaining by familiarizing is explicit in the text. Descartes makes it explicit in the text. He understood that he was using pictures of a certain kind to explain by familiarizing. Different sort of picture, an abstract picture in the optics, doesn't explain by familiarizing because it's not familiar at all. What it does is explain by analyzing. And again, this technique is explicit in text. Concrete pictures, like parts of this picture, use conventions of realism. And they're conventions of realism that we all see every day in our image-saturated world, and we accept them without ever thinking about them. Conventions of realism. These conventions include perspective of a certain kind, shading, also putting things in a natural setting. Like if you look at the bushes behind the human figure there and the sort of weeds in front, those are natural setting conventions of realism, along with perspective and shading. However, concrete pictures can also be used in a way, as this one is, to violate conventions of realism. As in this picture, there's a line which shows what happens next, not at the time slice of the image itself, but what happens next after the ball leaves the racket. So there's the line. And what that line shows you is where the ball's going to go when it leaves the racket, which of course you couldn't see if the ball was still at the racket. So it's violating the convention of temporal realism. And that image in Descartes' drawing is really no different as to the use of the lines than the use of the lines in the cartoon figure on the lower right. It's the same sort of convention. Abstract pictures like this one don't use conventions of realism at all. Here, what the lines do is to show bouncing balls, and the balls are bouncing in a completely non-natural setting. Such a thing as that was never seen in the world by anyone. This, on the other hand, also from the optics, it's a concrete picture of a tub using conventions of realism. The shadow, for example, is a very familiar convention of realism. And right away, when you see it, nobody has to explain to you that that's the tub casting the shadow. You know what it is when you look at it. But the conventions of realism are violated by other things, by solid and dotted lines, which show what can't be seen. Descartes has a theory about how rays can move around the tub and how this helps explain this cosmology. And that's what the dotted lines and solid lines are for. And of course, they're not anything to do with conventions of realism. This concrete picture is a picture of a sightless man. Conventions of realism, well, look at the dog behind the man on a leash. What's that for? It's to make the setting look natural. But the conventions are violated. Look at the dotted lines on the sticks. Why are they there? They're there to put the sticks in motion. And what the result of that is to make the picture diachronic, constant, not just the time steps. Concrete pictures, this is from the Principia. Concrete pictures here are pictures of a hand and a sling, but they're mixed with abstract geometry. And they're also mixed with dotted lines of the same kind that we just saw of the optics. Here, a non-natural convention, the dotted line convention, puts the sling in motion and makes the picture diachronic. There are the concrete hand and sling, the non-concrete dotted lines of geometry. And the work being done is to put the sling in motion. That's what the pictures do. Now, this is also from the optics. That's a lens making machine. There's a whole chapter, maybe 2 chapters in the optics about how to make lenses. And this is a machine to make glass lenses, and it's a very complicated machine. If you look closely, what you can see where the arrow is pointing is that you're being told to see through parts of the machine that, of course, you couldn't see through if you were actually looking at the machine. No more than I can see my hand as I'm looking through this table. But that's what the picture's telling you to do. It's telling you to see through a solid object. This is the next page from the optics. And here, things go even farther. What you're seeing is a section of the same machine, but this part of the machine is taken apart, and the parts are suspended in explanatory space. You can see them sort of hanging in air there. And this is a convention of illustration, not a convention of realism, but a convention of illustration that has a name. And its name is a disassembled view, because the object is taken apart. It's disassembled. Conventions of illustration are not the same at all as conventions of realism. For seeing through, there are transparent views. For seeing through, also cutaway views. For seeing to take apart, disassembled views. For seeing to take apart, exploded views. For seeing far away, magnified views. For seeing close up, also magnified views. And for seeing in motion, like the dotted lines we saw, there are ghosted views. Conventions of illustration, despite the name illustration, it's a bad name for the convention, but that's what they're called. Conventions of illustration, despite the name illustration, are explanatory techniques of picturing. And the explanations in question were explanations seldom seen before printing was invented in 1450. But now they're universally understood. If you open the optics and you see these things yourself, you'll know what they are right away. And the reason is that you've been looking at these conventions, sometimes in printed books, sometimes on screens, all your life. That wasn't true when Descartes was writing his books. His conventions were much newer. Conventions of illustration that explain. So here's something that you see, you get it as soon as you see it. If somebody asked you to describe that, eventually I think you would probably come up with some expression like a transparent house. And what you're being shown is indeed a house with all its parts. But of course, no whole house can really be transparent in the way that this is shown as being transparent. So it's a pictorial convention of illustration, not a convention of realism. Same sort of thing here. This is a whole engine with all its parts, an internal combustion engine. And again, if you saw that, you know exactly what was going on. This happens to come from a Honda owner's manual, and you see it right away. But no whole engine is really disassembled in this way. It's a pictorial convention of illustration. For many tasks of explaining, concrete pictures are better than abstract pictures. For many tasks, familiar items are better than unfamiliar items. Pictures are better than non-pictorial signs for many purposes, especially for purposes of making pictures accessible to remote observers through the optic experience. That's what those pictures are particularly good for. The house, the engine, these are concrete, familiar items, things that we instantly recognize as soon as we see them. To explain phenomena of light, Descartes chose an odd picture of concrete and familiar things. And the picture he chose was a man batting a tennis ball into a pond. That's the picture he chose. So there's the picture. I'm sure you've seen various versions of it. I think this one even shows up in Copenhaver's English and standard English translation. In Leiden, while Descartes lived there, the university provided a tennis court. The university built its own tennis court in Leiden. So many people knew what tennis looked like in Leiden when Descartes was there. So this is a picture of the tennis court as it was in Leiden in 1611, a Leiden tennis court. And the person who made the picture was named Princeton-Bucharest, and his picture showed 4 players in the tennis match and 6 spectators. Viewers of the print were also spectators, right, in a group that formed the community of tennis. And how did that community get formed? By looking at a printed book. So 4 players, 6 spectators, and then many, many other viewers of the print were also spectators. So if you look at the print on the left, you can see the players, and then in the gallery on the right, you can see the spectators. And then here we are watching it now, as people could have seen the book remotely at the time. And those people also would have been observing as spectators. So different levels of remoteness and spectators. Spectators who saw the tennis picture in Van de Haas's book were a community who shared tennis remotely as a visual experience. Their community was apoptic, and it was just one of many such. An apoptic community remotely having visual experience of a certain kind. From these apoptic experiences and other such experiences, people who never hit the tennis ball, people who never did that would recognize the ball in a racket. And this explains why Descartes could use tennis to explain light, because tennis was a familiar sight, sometimes directly, sometimes apoptically. Now, this seems pretty banal, right? So what? Well, when you think of the conditions of production of these pictures and what came before Descartes, what was there as Descartes found it, it's actually pretty remarkable. The ability to provide experience that's not just direct, but also apoptic in the way that I'm talking about. Tennis was familiar in Leiden in 1637 when Descartes published this picture of likewise, baseball is now familiar enough to introduce for us something very abstract, to introduce it to people who know a little about baseball. And this thing that needs to be introduced is the counterintuitive finding that not all infinities are the same. So that's the task. How do we introduce that counterintuitive finding? The apoptic experience of tennis and light in the 17th century is like the apoptic experience of baseball now in Princeton in the 21st century. So there's a baseball park not very far from Princeton in 1887. And the parts of the baseball park we'll be interested in are the first baseline, third baseline. That's the line there indicated by the arrows. I think that baseball can familiarize Cantor's number theory, just as Descartes thought that tennis can familiarize physics of light particles, both explained by familiarizing both the baseball and the tennis. So what do I mean by that? To show that not every infinity is the same, Cantor used a diagonal proof. That's what it's called, diagonal proof. Its structure is partly visual. My own view, not completely an expert view, I'm not a mathematician. I think his proof is ineliminably visual, but that's another story. Anyhow, he used this diagonal proof famously, and its structure was partly visual, yet far from familiar to many people. So there's a kind of array of numbers that Cantor was talking about in his proof. And the way the proof goes, you're meant to see a diagonal on a path to infinities. It's constructed in this array by following a certain set of rules. It's a visible array of numbers in Cantor's diagonal proof. Seeing this array on paper, however, many people would not know what it is. But that's not true of seeing a baseball diamond on paper. A lot of people who see a baseball diamond on paper know what it is. A lot of people who saw that picture would know that it's a picture of a baseball park. Many more, I think, than they would know that that's a component of Cantor's diagonal proof. So here's the same baseball park shown abstractly in an abstract picture. Play with this abstract picture. What we'll say is that as lines, you can't quite see them too well, the picture's too small, but the line on the group of letters on the bottom, as those lines A, B, C, D go to infinity, areas E, F, G go to infinity. And areas E, F, G are infinite and not the same. And I think the baseball image shows you that. Infinite baseball, then, is a pictorial way to show that not all infinities are the same. Cartesian tennis is a pictorial way to show that light particles behave as Descartes thought they behaved. Pictures of tennis, pictures of baseball, both explained by familiarizing. That's what they do. Cartesian tennis and infinite baseball both explain something that's abstract and unfamiliar by a familiarizing analogy with something that's concrete and familiar. That's how, those are the poles of the analogy, which is an explanatory analogy. Before 1450, there just were no apoptic experiences. However, a few medieval people made explanatory pictures and saw them in manuscripts. Before 1450, makers of manuscript books developed conventions of illustration that were used later in printed books to produce apoptic experiences of pictorial explanation. So here's a good example. This is by a man named Villaut on the Clore. It's from before 1250, and it's a manuscript of machine drawings. We would call them engineering drawings. All kinds of interesting machinery on this particular page. And if you look closer at the bottom left, you'll see there's an eagle. And if you look even closer at the eagle, you'll you'll see that the eagle is an automaton. It's an eagle that's meant to move on its own in church. That's the kind of eagle. And you can have the automatic machinery right inside the eagle. This is also from a medieval manuscript. It's an ant. It's got too many segments. Ants only have 3 segments. This has 4. It's a mistake. But it's a really interesting mistake because it shows the ant enlarged very clearly before there were any microscopes. So it's a particularly remarkable image in that regard. And there are lots of these images in the Middle Ages, images that were meant to explain things by looking at them closely. After 1450, this kind of manuscript drawing for explanatory purposes continued. It didn't stop. And some of the medieval pictures made in this way were superb, but they were never experienced in the apoptic way. Here's an excellent example. This was made by Leonardo in 1478, and it's a manuscript drawing of gears in an exploded view. And it explains how the parts of the gears go together by giving you a picture of it, a disassembled view, as it's called. Leonardo's engineering drawing was an explanatory picture. It was made by hand, and it wasn't copied until the 19th century. So it produced no apoptic experience. The picture existed. Leonardo made it, but nobody knew about it. It produced no apoptic experience. Here's an architectural woodcut of the same period by a man named Giovanni Giocondo. It was also explanatory, but this one was printed in the book, and that made it a basis for an optic experience. So here's the picture I'm talking about. Might be a little hard to figure out what's being pictured there. If you sat with it, you could see that this is a cutaway view of a building, and you can see there are walls there indicated by the arrow. And then down at the bottom, you can see water, and there's a floor. So it's basically explaining how a drainage system works in a house. And it does this by showing you something that you can't really see. How do you get to see it? Well, pictorially, by cutting things away. That's why it's called a cutaway view. Many people saw that drawing, Giocondo's drawing. Almost no one saw Leonardo's drawing. And even Leonardo, genius that he was, could never have made visibly exact copies of his drawing by hand. That could not have been done. And that was true for all pictures in medieval manuscripts. Most medieval manuscripts, in fact, had no pictures in them at all. And even when words were terribly important, even when pictures were terribly important, even when words were actually useless without pictures, sometimes manuscripts don't have any pictures. This is true of a very famous book about architecture, for example, Vitruvius's De Architectura, the most famous Latin work about architecture. There are 80 medieval manuscripts of Vitruvius. 0 of those manuscripts have pictures. First printed edition, 1486, has 1 woodcut picture. Next edition, 1511, 136 woodcut pictures. So after centuries and centuries and centuries, finally, somebody said, look, it's a book about architecture, so we better put some pictures in it. And they did, and those pictures explain things. Explanatory pictures. Globally, between 1450 and 1500 in Europe, 50 years after printing was invented, about 28,000 different editions of books were published. 20,000. We just focus on England. Focus on England because the statistics happen to be good from England, not because England is special in any way. Between 1495 and 1500 in England, 199 books published. Fast forward to when Descartes was alive, between 1635 and 1640, 3,267 books published. So what we get over that period of time, in other words, is an increase of, by a factor of 16 in the number of books published. Enormous change in how information, especially pictorial information, came to people. And while Descartes himself was working, the number of books printed in Europe grew to hundreds of thousands. Lots and lots of books. And this was a huge disruptive novelty in the world as Descartes found it in 1637. Followers of Descartes printed two disruptive pictures of the human body as a machine, as an automaton, like the moving eagle that you saw in Villars' manuscript. So there's the eagle that we look at. And it's important to understand that in this medieval manuscript, it is a picture of an automaton with the machinery inside. An automaton before 1250. Two Cartesian automata in different editions of the Treatise on Man explain how the pineal gland works, how it works physiologically, how it works anatomically, how it works mechanically. What La Mettrie would call a non-machine. There's one of these images. This is the one that's less frequently seen. Descartes' automata. This is another one, the one that's more frequently seen. And if you look, you can see that you're seeing through. You've got a transparent view of something in that picture that really you couldn't see if you were looking at it in nature. For picturing the body as a machine in this way, the best models available weren't available for optic viewing. And those were drawings made by Leonardo, who was an engineer. And when he made his drawings of the human body, he showed you the body engineered. So here's a famous Leonardo drawing of tendons and neck. And you can see that the presentation of these biological elements in the human body is quite structural, right? It's not quite mechanical, but it certainly is structural in the engineering way. Leonardo's anatomical machinery went unseen. Nobody saw these pictures. But there was a popular genre of picture books called Theaters of Machines that showed the workings not only of humanoid automata, but also of other biological machines, including a Clockwork Apple. But this is peculiar. That's an apple, and as you can see, it has some machinery inside it. It's odd because you don't think of apples as having machinery inside. We'll talk about that later about what machinery is for, but that's not the point. The point is it's an apple and it's got machinery inside, just as the eagle had machinery inside it. It's an apple. Less bizarre and more common pictures were in books called Theaters of Machines. And then what they did was they showed the workings of moving statues that were seen in gardens owned by people who could afford to own such gardens. This is one of them. It's a picture by Jacques Besson of a hydraulic garden statue that was published in 1578. Quite a famous book, A Theater of Machines. And if you look at this picture, it's a little too far away. Sorry about that. Going from right to left, counterclockwise, or no, right to left. Yeah, that's counterclockwise. So up at the top, you've got little storm gods who are spouting rain out of their mouths. And then on the left, you've got a god who's turning and pointing to an astronomical circle. And then down, you've got water that seems to be flowing through that chair into a fountain. And then on the right, you've got underground plumbing shown in a cutaway view. In other words, if you were standing in front of that garden statue, you couldn't see the plumbing. You could see the effects of the plumbing, but you couldn't see the plumbing. Here, you're shown the plumbing in a cutaway view. Why? To explain how the automaton works. It's explanatory picturing. Descartes described garden automata in the Treatise on Man while he was introducing his pineal gland automata. So there's one of the illustrations from Treatise on Man on the pictures on the left. And on the right, there's the automaton from the Besson's Theater of Machines. And what you get is you get transparent, ghosted, and cutaway views of plumbing inside the automaton and under the ground, where you can't really see them. That's the point of the cutaway views as conventions of illustration. So the dotted lines on the boy give you a ghosted view of where the plumbing goes underneath the arm which are already shown transparently going through the whole body. And then the plumbing is shown transparently underneath the skin, not underneath the arm. And as in the picture, the ground is cut away to show the plumbing that's underneath. Before Descartes wrote his own picture books, before he did that, before he wrote books with disruptive power that was both constructive and destructive, millions of visual detonations exploded in pictures like missiles and automaton. And these were experienced in Coptic communities. For historians of the subject, philosophy as Descartes found it is no less worth investigating than philosophy as he left it. That's my view. So we should keep asking questions about meditation, about method, and about other well-known Cartesian topics during the 2 centuries before 1637. That's an important thing to do. We should also ask about picturing and look for answers in pictures that Descartes and his followers had printed in their very own books. To investigate these pictures, I've relied on conceptions of disruptive pictorial technologies that shaped Coptic communities while Descartes promoted his new scientific philosophy. I've taken the notion of disruptive pictorial technologies from Walter Benjamin, but the notion of Coptic communities is my own. Nobody else can be blamed for that. That's my fault. Thanks to Benjamin for the inspiration, and thanks to all of you for listening to me and looking at pictures that are even more than I am. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brian. I think we're going to take a brief break. Is that okay, Claudia?
Yeah.
And,
Maybe
yes.
during the break, we still have some tech stuff to fix.
Yeah, what? Yes. Let's figure out how to fix the text. Okay, there's lunch outside for those of you who are in this room. I'm sorry we can't invite everybody else to lunch. But just outside the room, why don't you get your lunch now? And then we'll continue.
We see if the problem has actually been solved.
Yes, has the problem been solved?
Okay, so the problem is that there's still some echo, and it's not clear that that's because there are 2 computers in the room at once. So maybe try disconnecting your personal computer, and we'll see if the sound gets better with that.
Okay, so what I will do is just simply turn off my computer.
So I've already off.
Okay.
This one's a sound pickup, right?
This, okay, I'm gonna,
Yeah, just leave the Zoom meeting.
If it weren't so visual, then we could probably just turn off that camera and just have this camera and that.
Dan, could we tell people how long the break is going to be?
the break is gonna be about 10 minutes. Is that okay? Let me see. Okay, I've just left the meeting.
Okay. So is this? Could you try talking so we see if there's the echo still?
Oh, this is a test. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Is this better?
To me, it sounds better. Does anyone who had problems before want to jump in and tell us if you can?
It does have an echo.
It still has an echo?
It does have an echo.
Okay.
It is certainly better.
So Ohad, for you, it is better.
It is
It's
better.
slightly better, but it does have an echo, and therefore I think that the problem is that Brian was moving around. So if you move around, the echo becomes worse and worse.
Okay, if I go like this, is it okay?
As long as you talk like that in one position, I hear you all right.
Okay.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's better because there's no interference anymore. So maybe if you could find a way to put your slides on this computer and not have the second computer, that would be.
How can I do that?
Email them to yourself and log in.
Okay, I will email them to myself. From this computer. And then Ina, can you help me figure out what to do next? Let me just a moment. Let me just email these to myself. Okay, I'm sending it now.
And then you just, log into your email here and download it. The presentation.
Okay. Just a moment. How can I?
So what do you work on?
I'm actually in the religion department.
Hi, Brian.
Your name? Islam Khan. Yes. So I work on Islam and colonialism.
Let me see. How do I go?
General.
Is it on a?
Oh, it's just on Princeton Mountain.
I work on politics. Somehow I'm bringing it into conversation with some of the trends in Western political philosophy. So I don't know anything about. I know very little about Western philosophy. So I'm trying to basically. So I mean, in the 18th century, 19th century, you have a lot of British colonialism, of course, and there's a lot of influence of Western political thought.
And some of that part of the world, some of the mainline philosophers. Were directly involved.
Yeah. John Stuart Mill is another one. Specific in India, he was
Chitford.
a lot of.
Oh, sorry.
Make sure.
So yeah, so I'm trying to figure out how to kind of put it all together in a narrative. Do something like that. So.
Can you get it to send me a push again? Oh, there we go.
Yeah, well, that's the story of our lives these days.
Book office, yeah, that's
I think it's trying to load
yeah. No idea. Question? Yeah.
let's share this on here when we're ready.
Okay,
And then you can.
I'll actually share a screen right now.
Yeah, that one.
Perfect.
Yeah, that's good.
And then to change it. How do I? Oh, well,
I think there's only one slide, right?
can you? Does that?
Maybe move the camera so that you can just sit next to the keyboard,
Well, we'll move the keyboard.
or move the keyboard if the.
Only one slide.
No.
Oh, that's weird because the file we open only had one slide. So we need to figure out what's going on there. We need to go to this. Yeah, this is only showing one slide. So let's find out why that is. Yeah, slide 1 of 1. So for some reason the version you sent on email didn't give the whole.
Let me try this again. Now that we've done this. Let's see. Save as. Okay, I know what happened. Let me, I did send the wrong file. Enoch, I'm going to send the right file. And
While we're there, can we try some of the other microphones in the room? So I know that if you press on the Zoom microphone, there are a few options.
okay.
Never seen it, but it's definitely 0. That's important. Space. What the hell? Space. No, that was the only Italian kid.
I don't think.
I'll check this.
Please have it. Okay, I just turn on high background noise suppression. Does that change anything?
No, there's some low level interference. I think it's fine, but it gets slightly worse when people are talking, so people complain in the chat about it. But it might be just from a phone or a hearing aid or something in the background that the microphone is picking up.
It's just the.
How do I get back to the, whatchamacallit, the email, because I just sent the correct file.
This one. Yes, this one should be large.
Yes. Good.
Yeah, okay, this one has slides.
But just. There we go. This is fine. Okay. Can we begin? How is the sound at this point?
If anyone wants to complain about the sound, this is the moment. So we're going to assume it's okay, I guess.
Are we okay?
Seems like it.
Okay, let me begin then. The title of this conference is Philosophy of Descartes Founded. That's taken from the title of Brian Copenhaver's new book, some parts of which you heard in his presentation just now. One of the themes of the book, which is not what it is that he talked about, but what it is that I would like to talk about, one of the themes of his book is a critique of the history of philosophy as practiced particularly in the Anglophone colleges and universities. In particular, he complains, and rightly I think, that the canon of authors taught, studied, and commented on by Anglo-American historians of philosophy is quite narrow, almost completely leaves out medieval and Renaissance figures who were important in their day, but who have largely fallen into oblivion. Something, of course, that Brian is talking about as a Renaissance scholar. This is where he begins the book and where he ends it. In chapter 5, called Bringing Out Your Dead, Brian notes the very few philosophers who are remembered to date and have found their way into the curriculum and the journals, and the very many who have not, ending with a list of 50 dishonored dead from the medieval and Renaissance period, who have been largely forgotten. He ends chapter 6, the last in the book, with a plea for us to return to the intellectual world before Descartes arrived and give it its due. He writes, and let me see. This is not, what am I doing wrong? Great. He writes, if philosophers now are to understand what then became of philosophy, how and why it became what it was as Descartes left it, the prior moment needs both philosophical and historical attention. Philosophers should visit this moment and call back their dishonored dead. In between, there's a lot of wonder in between the beginning and the end. There's a lot of wonderful material about what it is that makes Descartes and his age so interesting. Suggestions about what made his philosophy modern. We heard some of them, but there's many, many more. I'm very much in agreement with what with much of what it is that Brian has said, but I'd like to approach it from a somewhat different perspective. Something did indeed happen in the late 1630s and early 1640s, when in 1637, Descartes published his Discourse on the Method and the 3 essays that it introduced, the Dioptrics, Meteors, and Geometry, and then in 1641, published the Meditations. As a distinguished scholar of earlier medieval and Renaissance thought, Brian is trying to articulate what happened at that moment and see the influences, see the way Renaissance thought penetrated into what we now think of as the modern, and understand what Descartes was doing that was new. Brian, in a way, is bringing our current understanding of the past to bear on this moment of time, to understand the way in which Descartes can be understood as the father of modern philosophy, in a way in which it would have been difficult for contemporaries, for his contemporaries to understand. But my own perspective is somewhat different. What I'm interested in is more literally philosophy as Descartes found it. That is, what interests me is that moment in the history of philosophy as it looked to Descartes and to his contemporaries. Notice here that I'm saying to Descartes and to his contemporaries. I don't presume that they have the same perspective. My answer will involve a number of components. First of all, what did they think philosophy was? What did they think of themselves as doing? Secondly, what did they think was the state of philosophy at that moment? Where had it come from and where was it going? Who were the important figures? And third of all, what role did Descartes and his contemporaries think that he, Descartes, played in the history of philosophy? It's one thing to look back at an intellectually significant moment with the wisdom of time past, knowing better than the participants could have known, both what had happened before and what was to happen later. But it's quite another thing to put ourselves into their shoes and try to understand what the transformation looked like to them at the time that it was happening. And that's the sort of thing that I'm going to try to do. So the first question is, what was philosophy in 1637? What was philosophy when Descartes found it? For the sake of time, I'm going to be relatively brief on this question. When Descartes and his contemporaries argued about philosophy, what were they arguing about? Philosophy was well defined in the schools, standardly as it was taught as a preparation for students who wanted to enter higher faculties of law, medicine, or theology. The famous Ratio Studiorum of 1599, which officially governed teaching in the Jesuit schools for the entire 17th century, and which was very influential on other institutions, gives precise instructions for the teaching of philosophy. The teaching of philosophy was to take 3 years and include logic 1 year, natural philosophy, that's to say physics, 1.5 years, and metaphysics and ethics together, just half a year. All pretty much structured around the reading of the Aristotelian corpus. This basic structure is reflected in the Summa Philosophiae Quadripartita, first published in 1609 by Eustachius de Santo Paulo, a professor at the University of Paris. The book was widely used and often reprinted in both Catholic and Protestant countries. It contained sections in this order: logic, ethics, physics, and metaphysics, again, following broadly Aristotelian documents. Virtually all of the authors writing philosophy outside of the context of the schools had been educated in the schools, so it's not surprising that the philosophy that they wrote was largely influenced by the philosophy that they had learned as students. The content was often, though not always, non- or anti-Aristotelian. In many ways, the structure was the same. And here I'm talking about the structure of the alternatives to the school philosophy. There isn't time to argue this in detail, but we can discuss it later if people would like. Logic, ethics, and metaphysics is familiar territory for philosophy. now as back then. But one obvious difference between philosophy as taught then and now is that in the 17th century, physics was considered a central part of philosophy. Indeed, it was the longest unit in the philosophical education mandated by the Ratio Studiorum and the longest part of Eustachius' Summa by a lot. And the bulk of Descartes' Principia Philosophiae, 3 parts out of the 4 parts of the Principia. There were to be 2 further parts that he never wrote, which were also, broadly speaking, natural philosophy. This is very significant. I think it reflects a fundamental difference between the conception of philosophy in the historical period that we're studying and the conception that governs departments of philosophy in the modern university. Eustachius begins with a definition of philosophy. Philosophy is defined as the sapientiae studium, the pursuit or study of wisdom. As it was understood, it was the general term for the pursuit of general knowledge about which certainty was possible. Its contrast was history, historia, the study of particulars such as natural or political history. The definition that Descartes gives of philosophy in the preface to the French edition of his Principles of Philosophy, 1647, is not that much different. The word philosophy means the study of wisdom, and by wisdom is meant not only prudence in our everyday affairs, but also a perfect knowledge of all things mankind is capable of knowing, both for the conduct of life and for the preservation of health and the discovery of all manner of skills. As Descartes found it, and as Descartes, Eustachius, and their contemporaries practiced it, philosophy was not a special subject in the way in which biology or physics or psychology are for us. It was the general domain that included all of these things and more. It was knowledge taken in the general sense, scientia. This is a radical contrast with what I take to be mainstream analytic philosophy today. The Anglo-American philosophy that Brian was talking about in his book takes itself to have a particular domain of problems and a particular set of tools that one can use to address these problems. For a guide to what this means, you might have a look at Timothy Williams' recent The Philosophy of Philosophy. Timothy Williams is, of course, a very prominent practitioner of contemporary analytic philosophy. This is definitely not philosophy as Descartes found it or left it. More generally, I would argue, if I had more time, that philosophy is not a stable category, but a moving target. This makes it difficult for us to compare philosophy as we find it now with philosophy as Descartes found it and left it. It's not surprising that the current list of canonical figures in philosophy is radically different from what we find when we get back in history. So is the subject of philosophy itself. Okay, now what about the state of philosophy as Descartes found it? My first remarks were quite general. Some cautionary remarks to keep in mind when we're talking about philosophy historically. Philosophy today and philosophy in Descartes' state were not at all the same subject. But this is just a prelude to some more pointed comments that I wanted to make about how to think about philosophy as Descartes found it. Brian approaches the question as a learned scholar of Renaissance and early modern philosophy, bringing a wealth of erudition to the question. And I'm interested in how it looked to Descartes and to his contemporaries. Let's begin with Descartes. How did it look to him? Well, Descartes tells us in part 1 of the Discourse on the Method that he was a smart and inquisitive child, quote, nourished on letters and eager to learn. He went to the Jesuit College of the Flesh, quote, one of the most famous schools in Europe, where he learned everything that they had to teach and was considered one of the very good students. Descartes goes through the curriculum that he followed when he was a student. making comments about what he learned in school. His remarks about philosophy are particularly interesting. Philosophy, he writes, gives us the means of speaking plausibly about any subject and of winning the admiration of the less learned. However, in philosophy, quote, there is still no point in it which is not disputed and hence doubtful. As such, it constitutes what he calls a shaky foundation on which to build the other sciences. In short, when he finishes his course of study, he writes, quote, I found myself beset by so many doubts and errors that I came to think I had gained nothing from my attempts to become educated by increasing recognition of my ignorance. And at that point, he tells the reader, quote, I entirely abandoned the study of letters. His ambition was to forget everything that he had been taught by his teachers and start philosophy anew. Descartes represents himself as breaking with the past and doing something radically new, starting a modern philosophy which will replace what he and everyone else was taught in school. While there's some exaggeration here, I think that this indeed is how Descartes saw himself and how he wanted others to see him and his place in the history of philosophy. Descartes, of course, does not mention any other names in this text, but he didn't have to. His contemporaries, those who went to school, would recognize what it is that he was talking about. In philosophy, it would have been largely Aristotle, as the Jesuit Ratio Studiorum explicitly requires, noting even the titles of the Aristotelian works that must be studied. But Descartes and his schoolmates would have learned their Aristotle largely in digested textbooks, like Eustachius, which Descartes explicitly mentioned as one of the texts he remembered from schools. The question is complicated, and there are different opinions among scholars. But I, for one, think that it is very unlikely that he was learned in medieval or Renaissance thought. I'm pretty sure that even Suarez, the late scholastic master of metaphysics, was largely unknown to him. What he knew of earlier philosophy was largely what it is that he learned in school, and by the time he wrote the discourse, probably much of that had been forgotten. Descartes saw philosophy as at an impasse at the moment he found it, and he represents himself as the first to recognize this and rejects philosophy as it was understood and wants to start anew. The self-appointed, self-anointed father of modern philosophy. But while this may agree with the way in which Descartes is understood in some later histories of philosophy, I think his contemporaries didn't see matters in quite that way. Aristotle was clearly important, if not central, to the teaching of philosophy in the schools in the 16th and 17th centuries, up to mid-century and beyond, in both Catholic and Protestant countries. Even though Aristotle and Aristotelianism were the dominant trends in the academic world, Aristotle was never without his critics. Aristotle was condemned at least 5 times in Paris in the 13th century and continued to be controversial even later. Nor was there any lack of critiques of Aristotle and Aristotelianism outside the schools, coming particularly from those who sought to revive Plato and Neoplatonism. In the 1620s, though, the critics of Aristotle and Aristotelianism take on a kind of corporate identity. It is at this time that they are identified as a separate and well-defined group and given a name, the Novatores. Marin Mersenne, for example, in his commentary on Genesis, lists Campanella, Bruno, Telesio, Kepler, Galileo, Gilbert, Bacon, Flood, Hill, and Basson as belonging to this group and identified as Novatores. In his widely read and cited work on collecting books and forming a library, the Avis pour dresser une bibliothèque, published in 1627, 10 years before Descartes published his discourse on the method, the scholar and erudite Gabriel Naudé, mentioned largely the same group as Mersenne had noted, organizing the philosophy section of a well-stocked library. And he notes, to begin, in philosophy, to begin, that's the section of philosophy books. To begin with that of Trismegistus is the most ancient. Of course it isn't. This, by the way, is from a 1661 translation by John Evelyn. Followed by that of Plato, Aristotle, and Ramus, and finished with the Novators. Thalassius, Patricius, Campanella, Verulamius, of course, that's Bacon. Gilbert, Jordanus Brunus, Gassendus, Basonus, Gomesius, Carpenter, and Goraleus, which are the principles amongst 1,000 others. So these are just the most prominent of the Novatores. But unlike Mersenne, who mentioned them to dismiss them as heterodox, nowadays considers them as essential for a good library. Neither are you to omit all those which have innovated or changed anything in the sciences, for it is properly to flatter the slavery and imbecility of our wit, to conceal the small knowledge which we have of these authors, under the disdain which ought to have, because they oppose the ancients, and for that they have learnedly examined what others were used to receive as by tradition. I affirm that all these authors are very requisite for a library, since according to the common saying, and I'll read this in English, furthermore, novelty is most agreeable in all things. And that it is certain the knowledge of these books is so expedient and frugiferous to him who knows how to make reflection and draw profit from all that he sees, that it will furnish him with 1,000,000 advantages and new conceptions. That's a very positive estimation of these characters. A more detailed account of these, as well as some of the, quote, 1,000 others to which Naudé alludes, can be found in an essay published by the novelist and philosophical popularizer Charles Sauvel in his essay Le sommaire des opinions les plus étranges des novateurs modernes en la philosophie, published first in 1655 and reprinted in 1668, largely unchanged. The list of novatores is repeated over and over throughout the 17th century with small variations. But what's interesting is largely unchanged. The names that we've seen are repeated over and over and over and over through pretty much the entire 17th century. Though Naudé and Sorel talked about the novatores in positive terms, it should be noted that most in the period did not. In the period, novelty did not have a good name. The term novator had a history in the Reformation and debates between the Church of Rome and those who sought to reform the Church, so-called Protestants. The Protestants accused the Catholics of introducing novelties in Christianity and saw themselves as returning religion back to its original roots. Needless to say, the Catholics saw things from a different perspective and saw the Protestants as the innovators. It wasn't surprising that the term moved from theology and religion to philosophy, now to name those who departed from scholastic orthodoxy as opposed to theological orthodoxy. As Nicholas Malebranche, a follower of Descartes, was later to write, truth and novelty cannot be found together in things of the faith, because men do not wish to make the distinction between truths that depend on reason and those that depend upon tradition. They do not consider that one should learn them in completely different ways. They confuse novelty with error and antiquity with truth. Luther, Calvin, and others innovated and erred. Therefore, Galileo, Harvey, Descartes are mistaken in anything novel they say. Luther's impanation is novel and it is false. Therefore, Harvey's theory of the circulation of blood is false, since it is new. It is also for this reason that they call both heretics and the new philosophers indifferently by the odious name of innovative, that's to say novateur. I should note that even though there was a clear opposition between the novatores and the more traditional schoolmen, there's a lot of rhetoric and polemic involved here. The novatores accused the scholastics of slavishly following Aristotle and ignoring reason in their senses, while the scholastics accused the novatores of seeking only novelty and self-aggrandizement and not the truth. Both were partially right and partially wrong. Neither were as bad as their opponents painted them, nor as virtuous as they painted themselves. But even so, the polemic continued. And I think that these are really polemical categories. Though Descartes knew of the novatores, he was loath to associate himself with them. In a letter to Isaac Beckmann, written in 1630, long before the publication of his discourse on the method, Descartes wrote, Plato says one thing, Aristotle another, Epicurus another, Thalesio, Campanella, Bruno, Basson, Vanini, where we heard those names before, and the novatores all say something different. Of these people, I ask you, who is it who has anything to teach me, or indeed anyone who loves wisdom? Doubtless it is the man who can first convince someone by his arguments, or at least his authority. Descartes is saying, we can't learn anything from anybody else anyway. Again, underscoring his own supposed originality. At this point, I'd like to turn to the question as to how Descartes was seen by his contemporaries. To put it bluntly, for many, if not most of them, he was just another one of the large group of misfits, the novatores. Philosophy, as Descartes found it, was something of a battle between an older orthodox and largely Aristotelian philosophy and a somewhat unwieldy number of philosophers who were challenging this orthodoxy. And I would say in very different and incompatible ways. Descartes was in competition with the Aristotelians, to be sure, but he was also in competition with the other novatores. But before entering into that issue, I want to make one more observation about the novatores. What's interesting when you examine them is just how shallow the memory of Renaissance philosophy was at that moment. Opposition to Aristotle and alternatives to Aristotelianism go back to at least the 13th century. But by the 1620s, much of that seems to have been forgotten. The earliest of the novatores is generally recognized was Bernardino Thalesio, whose major work, the De Rerum Natura Juxta Propria Principia, began to come out in 1665, but was completed only in 1686. In 1637, as Descartes' first writings began to be published, it was Thalesio, not Descartes, who could properly be called the father of modern philosophy. Though there was a large and rich tradition of medieval and Renaissance philosophy, it's not clear how live it was to many of the practitioners of philosophy at that moment. If they could point to Thalesio in basically 1586, as being the start of a new tradition. Okay, so Descartes, the last section, Descartes among his contemporaries. As I've emphasized, at the time Descartes began to publish, the philosophical world already had its share of innovators, thinkers who saw themselves as setting aside traditional philosophy and starting anew, the novatores. How was Descartes received in the philosophical world? Did he get the hero's welcome that he might have thought he deserved, given his rhetoric in the discourse on the method? Not exactly, I think is the answer. There was quite a reaction to the publication of the discourse on the method and the essays and to the meditations when they came out 4 years later. but it wasn't the reaction that Descartes had hoped for. The trouble started with a series of disputations sponsored in 1641 by Henricus Regis, a professor of medicine in Leiden. In Utrecht. Regis, then a friend of Descartes and expositor of his ideas, offended Gisbertus Fiscius from the theological faculty of Utrecht by attacking Aristotelian natural philosophy. Descartes, living in the neighborhood, inevitably got drawn into the dispute. And I will point out, in the beginning at least, this is a fairly local thing. This is Descartes in Utrecht, around where he was living. The dispute exploded outside the confines of the university and soon became a legal dispute over the right to teach Descartes' philosophy at the university. The details are much too complicated for this context, but one interesting document connected with the dispute was a book written by Martinus Schuck, a disciple of Fiscius, intended to support Fiscius' position in the university. This was the Admiranda Methodus Novae Philosophiae Renati Descartes, the admirable method of the new philosophy of René Descartes, published in Utrecht in early 1643. In the Admiranda Methodus, Descartes is discussed squarely in the context of the Novatores, in whose number he is counted. The names of Gorlaeus and Turellus come up often in the book. They were very much at issue in the earlier disputes in Utrecht involving Fiscius and Henricus Regis. But among the Novatores, Schuck also includes Ramus, the two Patrices, Delesio, and Passon. In the book, Schuck criticizes innovation and innovators in the most extravagant and derisive terms, including especially Descartes. After this first appearance as a novator, Descartes appears regularly in later lists of novatores. Not all of the response to Descartes was unfavorable, of course. Regis, whose disputation started the book, The Business in Utrecht, remained a fan of Descartes, though Descartes did not think so, and published a number of books quite favorable to Descartes, which Descartes denounced, though they actually did become later standard expositions of Cartesian philosophy. So did others, including Johannes de Rey, author of the Clavis Philosophiae Naturalis, seu Introductio Aristotelico-Cartesiana, an attempt to sort of reconcile Aristotle and Descartes. Also, Adrian Herbourg, professor of philosophy at Leiden, a teacher of Aristotelian philosophy, as well as a defender of Descartes, and one Benedictus de Spinoza, who wrote an exposition of parts of Descartes' Principia Philosophiae in geometrical form. This is the only book that Spinoza actually published under his own name while he was alive. Descartes quickly received attention in the Low Countries where he was residing and where he was a local character. But in his native France, recognition came a bit later. There were, of course, the objections to the Meditations, which included contributions from Mersenne, Antoine Arnaud, then a professor at the University of Paris, Pierre Gassendi, then a professor at the Collège Royal, and Pierre Bourdin, a professor at the Jesuit Collège Clermont in Paris. But these were invited interventions, people who have been specifically asked to talk about Descartes' work. Recognition in France came more slowly than in the Low Countries. As part of an introductory essay to his French translation of Jean d'Espagnier's Enchiridion Physicae Restitutae, A curious alchemical work, Jean Bachou placed Descartes, recently deceased, among the new philosophers of his age. In addition to Descartes, who the translator featured, Bachou included many of the regulars we have seen in other lists: Thalesio, Patrizzi, Campanella, Bacon, Claude, Cornelius, Carellus, and Ramus. But in their number, he included this rare gentleman, Descartes, whose inventiveness and subtlety he valued. Descartes is also included among the many, many figures that Charles Sorel discussed in his 1655 essay on the Novateur that I noted earlier. But in both cases, Descartes was one among many. He was also the subject of two books by an obscure figure, and somewhat mysterious figure, Jacques Torrure, his Physique, 1653, and his Philosophie divisée en toutes ses parties, 1654, both of which have the explicit goal of reconciling Descartes' thought with that of Aristotle. But things don't really get going in the French community until the end of the 1650s, when Claude Clair-Sellier, Descartes' literary executor, began to publish his Nachlass. The letters began to come out in 1657, followed by the Traité de l'Homme in 1662, in the Latin edition by Sproul, and in 1664 in the French edition by Clair-Sellier. Starting in 1663, Descartes' name and his views in optics and cosmology begin to appear in mathematical theses defended in the Jesuit Collège Clermont in Paris. Starting in the mid-1650s, Jacques Rouault began weekly lectures and demonstrations of Cartesian physics in his home in Paris. Eventually, Rouault became a major figure in Parisian intellectual life. His textbook on Cartesian physics, the Traité de Physique, first published in 1671, was a great success and was used well into the 18th century. And on, the name of Descartes began to appear in more and more places. Not all of them were positive, of course. The discussions of Descartes at the Collège Clermont that I mentioned were almost exclusively attempts to refute Descartes. But things got so out of hand at various French universities where the students were agitating for Descartes that Louis XIV had to issue an edict in 1671 forbidding the teaching of Descartes in universities. Descartes, initially one among many novatores, was emerging as the leader of the pack. Gerardus de Vries was a professor of philosophy at the University of Utrecht, loyal to Aristotelian philosophy and profoundly hostile to newer currents, particularly Cartesianism. In a public disputation given in October 1683, the second in a series titled Introductio Historica ad Philosophiam Cartesii, Historical Introduction to the Philosophy of Descartes, de Vries set out his own historiographical view of the previous half century in philosophy. On this view, quote, in the last 50 years, the divided kingdom of the philosophical world has contained these three sects: the scholastics, the more liberal peripatetics, and the Ramists. The first was what was taught at the Catholic universities, the second in the Protestant universities, and the third in the gymnasia. But this is what he had to say about the novatores. Concerning the Patricis, the Gorlaises, the Keplers, the Galileos, the Bassons, the Talesios, the Campanellas, the Boots, the Bacons, the Gilberts, the Bergars, and numerous other novatores. I will not add even a word, since this whole bunch never came together into a unity so as to make up a proper sect. Descartes isn't mentioned here, but Descartes is the subject of this entire series of disputations, and in fact of a great deal of de Vries' work. Descartes was, the reputation of Descartes, in fact, was central to de Vries' life's work. By the time he was writing, the names of the novatores from the 1620s remained, but their doctrines had been largely forgotten. Descartes, however, remained and still needed to be refuted. In 1690, at the end of the century, Father Gabriel Daniel published a curious work, Voyage du monde de Descartes, Voyage in the World of Descartes, a wildly popular book, soon translated into Latin and all of the European languages. The book was a critique of Descartes in the form of a fantasy in which Descartes' soul, detached from his body and unable to reattach, continued to wander through the world as Descartes imagined it in his mind. This enabled the narrator, a stand-in for Father Daniel himself, to have imaginary conversations with Descartes. At one point in the voyage, Daniel's stand-in remarks to the fictional Descartes that you have the good fortune with your luster to efface all the new philosophers that have risen both in and since your time. As in Spain, the name of Lutheran is indifferently given to all heretics of whatever sect or faction. So the title of Cartesian is attributed to all those that have undertaken to make refinements in the point of natural philosophy. In this way, a creation myth is formed, and the true origins of modern philosophy and science in a chaos of competing novatores came to be forgotten. In this way, Descartes becomes the father of modern philosophy, though it may have taken a while for him to attain that position, in part because he came to be noticed more and more, but also in part because his competitors came to be forgotten. Philosophy did not change suddenly and dramatically in 1637, but it is only retrospectively that that moment came to be important. We may focus on Descartes in the year 1637, but his contemporaries didn't. Thank you very, very much.
So are we jumping straight to the third talk now?
I think so.
Okay, Calvin, do you want to share your screen?
Yes, let me do that. And I'll try to be as quick as possible so that we can have time for questions. So am I audible, et cetera, et cetera? Everything okay?
Yes, you can see it fine.
Okay, so let me begin. So Brian's project in Philosophy as Descartes Found It is at least in part to make us aware that the way we now see the prehistory of Cartesianism leaves out much of what in fact philosophy was at the time and what was influential in the milieu in which Descartes worked. And it leaves out a good deal of the prehistory, and we ignore all of that at the cost of misunderstanding what happened and why. And I agree with that. I also agree with what Dan has just reminded us of, that namely that philosophy is a moving target. And I would go further and say that philosophy is what Ian Hacking used to call a humankind. It's something that is reshaped over time by our conception of what it is, something akin to the way in which breeds of dogs are shaped by conceptions of what they should be like. Dan draws from this the conclusion that, and I quote him here, "It's not surprising that the current list of canonical figures in philosophy is radically different from what we find when we go back in history. So is the subject of philosophy itself." End of quote. And Dan points out that in the 17th century, much of philosophy was natural philosophy, and that included what we would now call physics and chemistry. And later on, of course, it then included what we now call psychology, physics and chemistry began to be separated in the late 17th century, psychology not until the end of the 19th. But given all that, it's no wonder that, say, Newton or Rouault or Wundt are not considered part of philosophy today. I don't, however, think that the neglect of the figures whom Brian brings to our attention is for the most part due to shifts in what counts as philosophy. And I don't think it's due either to a general ignorance of medieval thinkers in the period in which Descartes wrote. Because leaving aside the figures who are now thought to dominate the later Middle Ages, Aquinas, Scotus, Occam, for example. By the way, Occam, Arnaud, Jean-Luc Soler pointed out to me years ago, Arnaud lectured on Occam in Paris in the 1640s. But leaving out them, it seems that such thinkers as Henry of Ghent, who was adopted by the Servites as their patron, Durand of Saint-Pourçain, Thomas Bradwardine, whose De Causa Dei was edited by Henry Saville in 1618, and many others were edited and studied in the first half of the 17th century. So something else was going on. It's not that people were ignorant of medieval philosophy. So what was that was going on? Well, I just want to make a couple of suggestions. Philosophy in the 17th century was the heir to philosophy in the 16th century, of course. And philosophy in the 16th century, like much of the human world, was partly a reaction to the interaction of various expansions, which threw up new problems and new suggestions. Here I am quoting myself, by the way, about what has counted as philosophy. So most obvious of these expansions was the European encounter with the Americas. Already by 1510, John Mayer, who was at the time the most important philosopher, I think, at the University of Paris, was remarking that the discovery of new lands suggested that there might be new discoveries to be made in the arts and sciences as well. And that idea seems to be quite widespread. It combined with the wide rediscovery of Hellenistic philosophical texts. Most of those, such as Lucretius's De Rerum Natura, had been around in the Middle Ages, but were not widely discussed. And this began to change in the 15th century, and in the second half of the 16th, Justus Lipsius represented or represented Roman Stoicism in a fashion that caught the attention. And all of this led to significant changes in the curriculum of the universities at the end of the 16th century. Brian pointed out years ago, for example, that Peter of Spain, whose textbook on logic had dominated Paris for well over a century, in the 1520s suddenly disappears, and Petrus Ramus begins to become the textbook for first year of logic courses. An important part of this curriculum change in general was the replacement of Aristotle's texts and texts that were based on Aristotle's texts, like Buridan's reworking of Peter of Spain, by more modern textbooks like Ramus. And a nice example of this is Burgerdijk's Idea Philosophia Naturalis. Let me just point you to Burgerdijk's little preface on this, where he says, look, 3 years ago, I published a model of natural philosophy for this reason, for you to know what in order to follow in learning the noblest and most extensive part of philosophy, while at the same time, for students who might use my lessons privately, I would record theses to dispute. For this purpose, the authorities I've cited are not the ancient Greek, Arab, and Latin interpreters, whose authority comes from antiquity, but the doctors of Coimbra, Zabarella, Pereira, Toletus, and the other new writers whom you usually consult for the basic outlines of philosophy. That's Brian's translation of Burgerdijk, by the way. So notice that Burgersdijk, who was rector at Leiden when Descartes enrolled there briefly as a math student, it seems, picked these Spanish scholastics as the examples of the characters the students were focused on, right? Okay, now, as Dan pointed out, Aristotle was not uncontroversial in the Middle Ages, even though commentary on his texts formed the backbone of the curriculum until the end of the 16th century. His hylomorphism was widely taken for granted even before his texts were available in the 13th century. And the category of forms, of eidos or morphe, was just about universally accepted throughout the Middle Ages. What became very controversial, however, was the interpretation that you find, for example, in Aquinas, of his, that is Aristotle's matter, his hyle, as a purely potential item. Right? Duns Scotus, Occam, and Buridan all claimed that to do the work in a hylomorphic scheme that was required of it, matter had to have some actuality of its own. And Buridan went on to point out already in the 1340s, that in that case, there was no reason to deny that matter could have features of its own, that is, be directly a subject of forms. Buridan's view was that the soul, and this is a general feature about forms, was, let me see if I can make this thing, there we go, was that the soul was like air or water. It was homogeneous throughout the body, and it was identical with what he calls its principal operations, the vegetative, sensitive, and intellectual powers being the same as far as the soul is concerned, and more specific operations like seeing, hearing, and digesting, requiring properly disposed bodily organs, eyes, ears, and stomach, for example. So Buridan's thought is that the form that say makes a horse, is completely homogeneous. And what differentiates the parts of a horse are features of the matter. So you can see that if you start to go down that road, the activities that people had ascribed to Aristotelian substantial forms are already being subsumed, if you like, as activities of matter. And that's what Buridan seems to be suggesting here. And this raises the question, why do you need substantial forms at all? And from then on, I think the defenders of substantial forms are on the philosophical defensive. Of course, their institutional prestige is enormous, but philosophically, they're on the defensive. Now, Dan presents the novatores as a polemical category, and I'm sure he's right about that. But I want to suggest there's also a philosophical unity to the polemic. The novatores rejected the theory of substantial forms. Many of them rejected all forms. Descartes came very close, right? And the novatores worked out various ways in which matter, qualified and quantified, could do the work that was previously assigned to forms. The one exception that everybody pointed to was the human soul, and this was for straightforward theological reasons. And there were competing theories of how the human soul could interact with the various material entities, including the human body. The Catholic Church insisted, first at the Council of Vienne in 1311, and then again at Fifth Lateran, that the soul was the substantial form of the body. And so it committed itself, unwisely, I think, in my view, to there being at least one substantial form. But that left wide latitude about whether there were any other substantial forms, and raised the question, indeed, of what forms, what work forms were doing at all. And some, for example, Suarez, thought that if one accepted a substantial form for humans, one would naturally extend this to other things. And so in Metaphysical Disputation 15, he writes this. He says, furthermore, from the composition of human beings, it's possible to infer that an aggregation of many accidental faculties or forms in a simple substantial subject is not enough to constitute a natural thing. Why? Because in humans, there are all those things, and you still need the substantial form. And therefore, in the other natural beings, there's needed a substantial form distinct from the accidents and more intimate and perfect than they are. Okay, now that was the defensive move that, for example, many of the Spanish scholastics were prepared to make. But it was not obvious to many by the end of the 16th century. And a unifying theme running through most of the non-Aristotelian philosophers of the period is that one can do with matter and accidental features whatever is needed to account for all of non-human nature. If one doesn't need substantial forms, then one can ask, does one need accidental forms? Could matter configured this way and that, but just in and of itself, do everything that forms could do? Descartes thought so, and he was working up ideas that we find in others, in Galileo on heat, for example. Okay, but this raises a question. So you can see my first thought is, what unifies the Novatores and what's really distinctive of what's happening in the period is the replacement of the conception of form by matter, the taking over of certain medieval thoughts about how matter could be configured. For example, that shape wasn't distinct from what was shaped, an alchemist view, and that therefore the idea that you needed substantial forms was beginning to disappear. In fact, that you needed forms at all was beginning to disappear. But this raises the question that I think comes up when we think about Brian's work on pictures. But if we have no forms, how are sensations and thoughts possible? The simplest Aristotelian model of sensation and thought is that both consist of the presence of forms in the appropriate subject, say color in the eye and the form of human in the intellect. Now, this picture had been criticized in many ways through the Middle Ages, but mostly from an Augustinian or Platonic perspective, which posited a soul of some sort going out, or in the remarkable view of Durandus of Saint-Pourçain, a pure externalism not so different from, say, Hilary Putnam's, in which all that happens is the soul gets related to objects outside. So that was one way that you could sort of have a theory of thought without having forms present in the sense organ or the intellect. Descartes took a different tack, and his was, I think, historically successful. And I want to suggest that's why he was particularly interested in pictures. Okay, now, Descartes didn't invent what came to be known via Locke, I think, as the way of ideas, but he was crucially interested in ideas. And since he had no forms, but only an immaterial mind and variously configured bits of matter with which to work, it was important that he be able to find a substitute for forms in mind with just those materials. And he was fully aware of this. As Celia Wolf-Devine pointed out in a book I only found a day ago, Descartes writes something, which we all know about from the Sixth Replies. Because the principal reason which moved philosophers to posit real accidents was that they thought that the perceptions of the senses couldn't be explained without assuming them, I've promised that I will explain these facts minutely with reference to each sense in my physics. Right? Okay, now, if Descartes cannot account for images without accidental forms, then his project will fail, right? So how then does he do it? Well, Descartes was heir to a tradition in which paintings and other objects made both by humans and by God were thought to represent intrinsically. And this, by the way, makes me think that there must be apoplectic communities before the invention of printing, because people in church would be looking at pictures, and those pictures would speak to them in a way analogous to the way in which woodcuts would later speak to people more remotely. By the way, we, of course, are here speaking to each other in an analogous way as well. In any case, these pictures were thought to represent intrinsically. And Descartes seems to think that there are corporeal images inscribed in the brains of both human and non-human animals, and to think that in some sense, in his early work, they can be called ideas. Right? So here's from Rule 12, the common sense functions like a seal, fashioning in the fantasy as if in wax the same figuras vel ideas, which come pure and without body from the external senses. Right? And the fantasy is a genuine part of the body, it's a material thing, and it's large enough to allow different parts to take on many different figuras and generally to retain them, in which case they come to be what we call memory. And and it's not those which are imprinted in the organs of external sense or in the interior surface of the brain, but only those which are traced in the spirits on the surface of the pineal gland, right? The gland H, where the seat of the imagination, the common sense, is located. And notice his language now, which must be taken for ideas, that is to say, for the forms or images which the reasonable soul considers immediately when, united to this machine, she imagines or senses some object. And then he goes on to say, I want to include generally under the name idea all the impressions which the spirit can receive in flowing from the gland, right? And this is from his early work on the treatise on man, which of course wasn't published in his lifetime. Now, Descartes' account of the mind begins from a picture of thought, which was also worked out in the 14th century, and indeed was advocated by Occam before he abandoned it for a more straightforward causal theory of reference, but which was kept alive within the Scottish tradition throughout the modern period until, through Brentano, it directly influenced Husserl, Meinong, Sartre, and Roderick Chisholm, right? This is the theory that thought is a relation between the mind and an intentional object, and an object which is a thought object and which has a kind of reality specified by that very relation. Objective reality. Okay. Now, Descartes spells out his attraction to this line of thought in the third meditation, where he distinguishes two ways in which we can think of an idea, namely as formally and objectively. Considered formally, an idea is a mode of mind, and thus understood, it's dependent upon the mind. No thinker, no thought. From this perspective, of course, every idea is the same. But ideas, properly speaking, are also, Descartes claims in the third meditation, tamquam imagines, as if images. And following the tradition which talked about intentional or representational or objective reality, Descartes supposes that an image is not merely the substratum in which it is, to speak in a kind of extended way, embodied. Thus, a painting is not merely a collection of bits of paint on a canvas, such as might by accident be produced by a team of monkeys working in the British Museum. And indeed, as he writes, right, suppose someone said that anyone can paint pictures as well as Apelles because they consist only of patterns of paint. To such a suggestion, we should have to reply that when we're talking about Apelles' pictures, we're not considering just a pattern of colors, but a pattern made to produce a representation resembling reality, right? So that's the part I want to focus on, such as can only be produced by skilled sort. So this, that there's more in a painting than the pattern of colors, is exploited by Descartes in his account of ideas. Just as a painting involves both an assemblage of colors and a picture, so an idea involves both a mode of mind and an object present objectively, right? And this second element, the object present with objective reality, has different degrees of reality in different ideas, and Descartes makes much of it in the Meditations. Moreover, Descartes insists that this second element has enough metaphysical status to require a cause, and that the sort of cause required depends on the sort of object, right? So the cause of this objective element in an idea must have as much reality formally or eminently as the idea has objectively. And that's how he proves the existence of God, for example, in the third meditation. Thus, the second element of his idea must have been caused by, of his idea of God, for example, must have been caused by God, and so there must be such a being. Now, this gives images for Descartes the special status he gives also to meaningful words. Descartes was fully aware that parrots can produce sounds resembling words, but he denies that as parroted, these are properly words. And similarly, perhaps the monkeys in the British Museum could produce patterns of color, but these would not be pictures. Against that background, then, pictures like sentences can be true or false, can be accurate or misleading. And so for Descartes, pictures and ideas really are at bottom the same, right? That is, they are fundamentally items in which the world can be present in a certain sense. Now, this raises a puzzle for the way Brian is thinking about this, and I think a puzzle for Descartes' use of pictures in general. And let me just quickly end with this. So return for a moment to the tennis player from Descartes' dioptrics, right? As Brian points out in the book, I don't think he mentioned this in his talk.
Because they're easy?
Sorry, as Brian points out, that is not an accurate picture. It's not what would actually happen if a tennis player struck a ball. A tennis ball wouldn't behave like that. And indeed, the whole idea that these pictures can be diachronic shows you that in some sense, we're representing not what is literally present in the picture. And Brian made much appeal to conventions when he talked about this. So now consider such a picture and ask yourself, what is present objectively in it? Right? This is not something that's directly caused by some object in the world in the way that a photograph might, or in the way that one of Apelli's, or say a portrait painter might be attempting to paint the portrait of something. Nonetheless, if these are Cartesian pictures, there's something in them objectively. And that something looks like it's misleading or inaccurate in this case. Okay, now it's not that the technology of the time didn't allow for accurate and even very detailed and pictures. And so, for example, if you look at these pictures, which are similar to the ones Brian pointed to, these were drawn by Christopher Wren, and they were drawn for Thomas Willis's Anatomy of the Brain. And Wren would go to Willis's dissection room and watch Willis carrying out these dissections and draw what he saw. So you can see what would be objectively present here is literally what Wren saw. But that's not what's going on in Descartes' cases. So the difference in terms of detail and complexity between this kind of thing and the kind of almost diagrammatic concrete pictures that Brian pointed us to, I think is striking. Descartes is literally leaving a lot here to what medievals would call productive imagination. But how can he, given his account of what pictures and ideas do? And to that question, I have yet have no answer, and I'll leave you with it. That's all, folks.
I'm going to put it to gallery view. Claudia?
Yes.
Why don't you deal with the
Okay, there's already a question. Yeah, there's a question in the chat, and you can tell me questions in your room.
Are there questions from within the room as well? Okay, we have one question from within the room as well.
Okay, maybe let's start with him and then Enrique.
Yeah, okay, that's.
Can you, why don't you come here so that, closer to the microphone so that,
So I have a question for Brian. It's very interesting talk. So perhaps two intertwined questions, because the first is regarding your point that the Apple apoptic experience was not there before 1637, or before that technology was invented. And the second question was that your description of that kind of experience being apoptic, because I think of the status of pictures before the invention of technology. I think of geometric diagrams in the Euclidean tradition, where, of course, in those manuscripts, there are no literally diagrams drawn, but there are descriptions, and the readers are supposed to draw them out themselves. So that seems to me to be a kind of apoptic experience created by the readers themselves. And also there's kind of active engagement on the part of the reader. So that seems to me to not have changed much after the invention of the very elaborate printing. So first of all, there seems to me to be some kind of apoptic experience before 1637. Also, there's that kind of experience not entirely passive, but rather involves a kind of active engagement. So what do you think about these issues?
Okay, I'm going to take on the first part of that, and it's Calvin asked basically the same question. It's an excellent question. But I want to come back to the second part about active engagement. But so let's put ourselves in a cathedral in the year, say, 1250, and let's say there's some images, let's call them paintings in the cathedral. The people together who are in the church seeing those paintings are sharing the visual experience. And those are two elements of the experience that I'm calling apoptic. Mm-hmm. The other two elements, they don't have. One is that the images are technologically produced. Mm-hmm. And the third image, the fourth element is that the sharing can be remote. So once the people leave the church, the sharing is over. But that's not true with apoptic communities, because apoptic communities who are viewers of books, right, can be any place at any time. And the reason that's so important is that particular feature of the images that were apoptically shared is that it's in that case shared by many people, not just synchronically, but diachronically over time, that the improvements that really early modern science was grounded on, Victorian, that's when those improvements become possible. Does that help?
Yeah.
So tell me about engagement.
Yeah, because in the Euclidean tradition, the readers are supposed to draw out the diagrams themselves. Mm-hmm. And also, I mean, in the Cartesian, especially in the geometrical cases, also in those mixed mathematical diagrams, the readers are supposed to, there's a can operate with the diagrams, mm-hmm. also can, solve problems with that. So so the apoptic seems to me to be a kind of very passive thing. It's just you just watch, but also there, I think the reader is also actively constituting the object.
Well, the engagement is certainly different than it is in the case of, let's say, we've got a geometry book, right? Yeah. And we've got a geometrical construction. And there's a way that we can participate in that particular kind of picturing that's very actively engaged. And we can do that mentally. I think we're pretty good at geometrical constructions. The kind of engagement I'm thinking of is one where people collectively share the experience of like those skulls that you saw made by Passeri, right? They're presented under certain conventions of realism. And if I'm an anatomist and I look at that skull, I say, oh, next time I look at a skull and I'm doing some anatomy and I'm making some pictures of it, I can do even better than that. So that's the level of engagement that I'm particularly interested in. Thank you. You're welcome.
Gideon Manning had a comment much earlier about this. So maybe Gideon, would you like to intervene now? I think it's connected to this conversation.
Sure. Let me just collect my thoughts for just a second. I mean, my own, if I were going to ask a question, I mean, I guess I would have asked a question about realism and this assumption that these images are somehow taken from objects as they are in the world. I mean, the anatomical cases in my mind are actually not realistic at all in some very deep ways. They're these composite images, often not taken from specific particulars. But the point I put up in the chat is just that you don't need images to create this common experience. And I had a specific example in mind that I mentioned, which is that Galen, for example, he explicitly advises readers to visualize certain Greek letters in order to understand the relationship among the cranial sutures. So he's not relying on any images, but he's certainly adducing concrete images in the minds of readers. And that's this kind of, I think, way station in his case between descriptions, textual accounts, and an actual picture. I mean, it assumes everybody knows the Greek letters, but I think that something similar has to be said about the images that come later. You're focusing on the images, but they don't exist by themselves. They're in a text. So you need both. You need, in this case, to create the experience, not just an image, you need a text in which it's embedded. Yeah, so
yeah,
that's my spend. Yeah.
When if I get lucky and someday you're able to see the book because somebody publishes it, well, you'll see that there's quite a lot in the book on that point about the interplay between text and picture. I didn't talk about it today, and the convention that's very important in that regard, and which now again is one of these things we take for granted, like a transparent view or an exploded view. It's labeling. Labeling doesn't grow on trees. So that very, very valuable interplay between text and picture, which is terribly important for pictorial explanation. That's a way of presenting pictures which had to be invented and was invented by people over time and got better and better over time, particularly after printing was invented. As far as Galen's particular circumstance is concerned, I don't really know anything about the manuscript tradition of Galen in Greek. But I do know the manuscript tradition of the Vitruvius in Latin, and there aren't any pictures at all in the medieval manuscripts of Vitruvius, even though there are 80 of them. I've never seen, in Kuhn's edition of Galen, I don't, maybe it's because I just don't remember or I read wrong, but I don't remember ever seeing any images in Kuhn's edition of Galen. And so let's imagine that's the way it was. And let's imagine Galen puts up, let's say in some work where he's talking about anatomy, let's imagine that he puts up some really, really good account of a skull, right? The experience of that couldn't, by definition, in the way I'm using the word apoptic. And remember, this is an invented artificial term. This is something that you're going to find in a dictionary in the way that I'm using it. The reason it couldn't be apoptic is simply because it's not visual. That's one of the features of an apoptic experience as I'm defining it: visual, shared, remote, and enhanced by technology. That's what I mean by apoptic experience. My hope is that accounts, right, which is artificial and a construct on my part. My hope is that account of apoptic experience will turn out to be useful for the purposes that I described today.
Yeah, let me just say very quickly. So it's one of the great mysteries in my mind about Galen is that there aren't any illustrations in that manuscript tradition. But I think the case of calling to mind letters of the Greek alphabet. Calling to mind letters of the Greek alphabet, and then using that as a way to then move to a description of that particular part of the skull, of the cranial sutures, that gets awfully close to the kind of visualization I think you're trying to call our attention to. I mean, one or two parts of it might not be there, but I mean, so long as you know the Greek alphabet, you're across space and time sharing a visual experience as you read through that text. That's just
visual experience isn't the visual experience of a picture.
Yeah, unless you know what the letter or the alphabet looks like, then it seems like it might be, no?
So what I mean by a picture is something that's drawn or painted on paper or sculpted in marble, or that's what I mean by a picture.
So a letter of the alphabet can't be a picture?
Aha, well, a good part of the book is about that. It's about the borderline. So I'm gonna assume everybody doesn't know. I'm gonna explain what a dingbat is. So a dingbat is a typographical form that's used by printers to break up space in books for different purposes, and they carry no semantic load. You've seen them all the time. They're little doodads that you see in print. They carry no semantic load, but they function importantly in books by signaling an end to one part of the book and calling attention to the beginning of another part. So in a sense, there's a message that gets sent by the dingbats, but I don't think they don't think that in themselves they have a semantic load. Even like the word, I'm not sure that letter A has a semantic load, right? But certainly the word bat has a semantic load. So there's a borderline there between what's pictorial and what's not. That's crucial for the story that I'm telling. And the best I can say now, Gideon, is that I didn't talk about it today, but that I do talk about it quite extensively in the book.
Fair enough. I'll look forward to reading the book.
Great. Okay.
There is a question from Enrique.
Hi, thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, so I want to make just one very brief suggestion, and I want to tie a couple of points that one Brian made, and also Dan Garber. And apologies if what I'm saying repeats what you have said, but I was listening attentively, and you know how children in Snoopy, in Charlie Brown cartoons, they hear the adults. That's unfortunately how I was hearing this, like blah 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 blah. One just very quick suggestion. I don't know if this is of interest to you, Brian, but I don't know if you've been looking at pictures of patents, right? Because they do predate the cutting off point that you suggested, which, if I remember correctly, was 1550 or something like that. So, for example,
Stop for a second. Pictures of what? I didn't quite hear you.
Patents.
Patents.
Patent.
Correct.
As in the 19th century.
No, patents as in having a patent, a registered mark.
A registered mark with a picture.
P-A-T-N-T, patent.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean Brunelleschi's right. Allegedly, Brunelleschi's well-known barge, right, was patented in June 19, 1421.
Yeah, I didn't realize that those were patents, but go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, because they all have explicatory, not all, sorry, but many of them have explicatory drawings. But anyways, so I am one, Brian, that takes very seriously pictures, and they cut. And what I see is a connection right between the pictures and what Descartes explicitly says about what his aim is with these pictures, and his use of the analogies that you mentioned, right? So the use of these analogies is to explain the functioning of the parts, right? And the nature of certain movements of, for example, the human body, right? And he does this through comparison with the functioning of the parts and movements, for example, of a purely mechanical device, right? And I think that that's strictly the spirit of Descartes' very well documented systematic use of drawings on the one hand, and macro mechanical analogies or models, right, in explaining micronatural phenomena. So, for example, as you mentioned, right, he compares the movement of light with the movement of actions of a blind man's stick, the movement of light with the juice, right, in a vat or of pressed grapes, right, the refraction of light with the tennis balls that you mentioned. I think you also have the conservation of motion drawing there, where he is attempting to explain the action of a sling, right? Mm-hmm. Now, one thing that has always seemed to me rather suspicious is that from all the numerous analogies that he uses and drawings, there is one analogy, the animal comparison with a machine, which incidentally, Descartes never used the phrase bed machine. He never once ever said that animals were machines. To my knowledge, right, nobody criticizes him for literally believing that light is a mere tennis ball, or saddle him with a sillier claim that tennis players can serve light at great speeds or what have you. So I'm curious about what do you make of that, and to tie this with I'll be brief, I promise. To tie this with what Dan's concern was in his talk, is I was delighted to see in the somebody put up a Burger's Dyke quote, and Gomez Pereira, the 16th century Spanish physician, was there, and I always seen a very strong connection between Pereira and Descartes. He anticipates explicitly the cogito in his Antoniana Margarita. And more importantly, right, the Antoniana Margarita, which was published in 1554 in Medina del Campo, this is contra Aristoteles, contra Aristotle. And he explicitly claims, not Descartes, he explicitly claims that animals are machines. They lack reason, they lack understanding, they don't think, they don't feel, they have no rational souls, and so on and so forth. So I'm curious to ask Dan, what the importance of Gomez Pereira is in this picture of the Novatores. Thank you, and apologies for being expansive.
Yeah, just very briefly, in the treatise on man, there's quite a long, there's a couple of paragraphs where Descartes describes the garden automaton, and he describes them specifically as machines. And then those two paragraphs are part of the foundation of a long account that he gives, in which his account of the child who gets his foot too close to the fire and the tube is running up the child's leg back to the child's brain. So it's that connection. But of course, he doesn't say, oh yes, and by the way, people don't have immortal souls in their machines. He gives it that.
Just to answer briefly to your question. I don't think I've ever seen Gomez Pereira mentioned explicitly in these lists of novatories. My sense is first half of the 17th century at least. The main references to Iberian philosophers, Portuguese and Spanish, are to Jesuit thinkers and to the classical, the Coimbrians, to Suarez, to those guys. Spanish language philosophy does seem to be a bit isolated there. There is a group in the early 18th century, and I think that they're mostly medical writers who are called the novatories, but they seem to be a different group of novatories. And the question of Gomez Pereira and who was reading him and how it is that he was understood is a really interesting one. I don't know, but it would be great to find out more.
I have a vague memory, Enrique, that and maybe this is wrong or a possible problem, but I think I remember that Borgersdijk mentions Pereira.
Yes, he does, and of course, together with the other Jesuits. Dan, I just disagree with you here. I don't think these guys were isolated at all. I think they were the common coin of university life.
Well, no, I think the Jesuits certainly were the common coin of university life. But one of the great questions is, wasn't there more than that going on? People who were outside of this circle. And I think that this has been one of the interesting curiosities, so I'm told, by Spanish historians of science, what was going on in the 17th century in the Iberian Peninsula outside of the established Jesuit writers who, no, absolutely, they were quite central.
Fair enough, yeah.
We have a question from Bob Adams.
Yes. I'm perplexed with about the way that you talk about the visual arts as something that had in the 17th century and later had perfections, as it were, ontological and theoretical perfections that they couldn't have had earlier on. But the sculpture of Greek sculpture in particular in the 3rd century before the Common Era, and both painting and sculpture in, say, the end of the 13th century of our Common Era in the work of Giovanni Pisano, reached, I would say, a perfection and accuracy that I don't see modern philosophy as improving on. And so maybe I've just failed to see what it was that you were getting at that would be special about that would make philosophy able to produce something in the way of the arts, and in particular painting and sculpture, that couldn't have been produced qualitatively in aesthetic value and so forth before that.
Thanks, Tom. That's a good. That's a good opportunity. I'm pretty careful not to ever use the expression, arts or fine arts or even pictorial art, anything like that. What I'm talking about is pictorial technologies, and that's quite deliberate. And I'm not making the case that philosophy improved picturing. I'm trying to make the case that picturing improved philosophy, rather the reverse. As for, let's say we've got an object of fine art, which is the equestrian statue of Marcus Aurelius on top of I said Hadrian or Marcus Aurelius, whoever it is, on top of the Capitoline Hill in Rome, right? That's of course a great work of art, and it could be seen and appreciated as such and experienced as such by many people at the same time. So it could be shared. So it's visual and it's shared, but it's not shared remotely. Once the people go away from the statue, they no longer have the visual experience of seeing the statue. Mm-hmm. That's part of what I'm talking about. Also, and a key dimension of this is that the reason for insisting on the distinction between arts on the one hand and technologies on the other hand is that it's quite important to me that the technologies are technologies of mass duplication. That various kinds of progress got made, the sorts of the issues that Gideon Manning was talking about. Things happened with anatomical picturing in the 16th century, and in lots of other cases too that I didn't talk about today. Things happened with that kind of picturing just because large numbers of exactly identical copies were made accessible to many people who could see them at different times. Not at the same, they could share them, but they weren't sharing them at the same moment. That never happened before printing was invented.
Yeah. And what is important about the fact that they could share them separately?
If you take, for example, if you take Descartes' picture of, not Descartes' picture. You can take Descartes' picture. Take Descartes' picture of the tennis player, and take the nearly contemporary picture by Princeton-Bucharest of tennis being played in light, right around the same time. Mm-hmm. So if I'm in a library, or if I'm in a cafe, or if I'm at home, or I've been in any place at all, I can have optically the experience of seeing the tennis match. The same thing is true if I am looking at Descartes' image of the tennis player. Now, put this in the context of Descartes' enormous capabilities as a writer of letters and a receiver of letters. Put this in the context of Mersenn's enormous capability as a writer of letters and a receiver of letters. The standard picture is that these networks of communication formed groups in the 17th century. Usually they're called invisible colleges. That's mainly the name for them. And there's an analogy between that and what I'm calling optic communities. And the reason the sharing is important of exactly the same images is it gave members of those communities the opportunity to comment scientifically to each other on exactly the same thing and to do that across time. That's what makes that crucial.
Okay. Is that in other words, what you're, it would be fair to say that what you're talking about is an achievement or in or augmentation of possibilities of cognitive and particularly scientific technology.
Yes, except I think that we're in the same church but a different pew. I think that the technology in this case is distinctly pictorial. Its applications are certainly scientific. I mean, the most famous case in this period being Galileo's pictures.
Yes, but I mean, when you think about it, I mean, an enormous proportion of technology of the physical sciences consists in our powers of perceiving the things that we're studying.
And I think what the pictorial technologies became capable of doing in this period was in enhancing those human powers in certain ways. That is to say, if I go back to let's say around the year 1250, and I'm looking at these wonderful manuscript drawings by Villard he's the one who made the eagle automaton, but lots of other pictures and machines too, right? Nobody knows how many people, if any people at all, ever saw those drawings that Villard made around the year 1250. As far as we know, they had absolutely no effect on the future of anything, whether it be science or architecture or bookmaking, or there's simply no record. There's no evidence of Villard's impact on anything, and yet the best collection of medieval engineering drawings, bar none, is in these 33 manuscript leaves that Villard made in 1250. Now, strangely, the same thing is almost true for Leonardo da Vinci, right? Who lived well into the age of printing, but didn't have his drawings printed. And as a result, when those drawings, those beautiful, beautiful drawings and scientifically and mechanically wonderfully explanatory pictures, when those pictures were made, they were never experienced in the apoptic way. And that's because Leonardo didn't show them to anybody except a few close advisors. They were certainly never shared remotely. As a result, nobody had the chance to say, oh, Leonardo was looking at those tendons in the way that he looked at them. And so when I look at tendons, I'm going to bear in mind what Leonardo saw, and I'm going to try to see it that way and do only better. The difference between Leonardo and Vesalius, first of all, Vesalius wasn't the great draftsman that Leonardo was, and he didn't draw his own pictures, right? Vesalius had people draw pictures for his book. And he did show them to thousands and thousands of people. And then those people used the access to scientifically stable images to make better images. And that's why you get images like those made by another anatomist like Casseri that I showed you. very easy sign, a very simple index of that is that if you look at Galileo's the Vesalius skull, you see roughly 20 sites of identification on the skull. If you look at Casseri's much finer engraving, which you see is about double that number. So more sites get observed than later, and that's progress.
Okay, that I can see.
Terrific question, Bob. Thanks.
Claudia, Enoch has a question. Is there?
Okay. There is another question, but Enoch can go first. Also, we should probably tell the people on Zoom how much longer we plan to go on for.
Why don't we just take these two questions and then end?
Okay.
Okay, so hi, I'm Enoch.
Enoch, why don't you come over here so that you can talk into the microphone?
Everyone, thank you for the talk. I just have two questions. One specifically related to the one that had been asked earlier, and just almost a clarification question. How would you say your thesis differs from the sort of rise of experimentation and the sort of significance of now, seeing physical experiments performed in which, presumably Descartes also participated in narrative, situating what Descartes is doing here? I'm especially thinking of something like, Chapin and Schaefer and Boyle as, they also talk about literary technologies in order to sort of portray the air pump and sort of, as a way of extending that sort of experimental site. And it seems like you're trying to do something slightly different. What would that be? And then the second, slightly related question is with regard to the pictures themselves, which is it safe to assume that they are Descartes' pictures, or they are presumably have been prepared by an illustrator, and how much does that complicate the argument if it may have been produced by someone else with also their own thoughts and just which may not have been exactly identical with the Descartes' picture? Thank you.
So you're going to have to remind me. The first one was Chapin and Schaeffer. Leviathan and the Air Pump, a tremendously important and influential book about the social experience of experimental science in the middle of the 17th century. A key difference between my work and theirs is, first of all, theirs has been a great success and mine hasn't. And second, that mine is predominantly about picturing. Theirs is primarily about how certain kinds of scientific experience gets socially authenticated and socially ratified in ways that they describe in great and I think compelling detail. Second question about who made the drawings. There's not a lot of information about that. One person whose name we know and about whom we know something, who helped Descartes with the drawings, particularly for the 1637 treatises, is a man named Franz von Schoten. I don't know whether Stephen is still here, but Stephen wrote something about Van Schoten in his book about one of the portraits, as far as I can see, there's no record. There is, Descartes mentions von Schoten's name from time to time, but as far as I know, there's no record of correspondence between them about making the pictures, right? So we just don't know. It's hard to imagine that some of the pictures could have been made with anything like the artistry that they were made in Descartes' books. For example, if you look at there are some anatomical pictures in the 1660 editions of the Treatise on Man, which are quite good for the time. Anatomical pictures. Hard to imagine that Descartes had that kind of pictorial. Maybe he did, but hard to imagine.
He didn't.
He didn't.
No, when you look at the diagrams and pictures in his manuscripts, they're pretty crude.
Yeah, and so your question is, does it make a difference? Does it make a difference? Sure, it makes a difference. I mean, if we've got, if we have a lot to say about the something on the page, and what we're focused on is its pictorial content. It's one thing if that was put there with Descartes' hand in some sense. It's another thing if someone was following his instructions. And that's just, that's just banal. How much difference it makes, different story. So most of the images in the 1637 treatises that employ conventions of realism, like the tennis player, they're pretty crude. They're almost cartoonish. And I think they could have done their job without much artistry. So I could imagine Descartes making sketches like the tennis player that look like that and would probably convey the same information. But that's just my guess. One interesting about Van Schooten, who worked with, by the way, since I don't speak Dutch, I don't know if I'm saying his name right, so I presume that's how you say it, Van Schooten, is that Van Schooten did make a portrait of Descartes, and it's one of the 5, I think, lifetime portraits. And take a look at it sometime, and what you'll see what's odd about it in terms of talking about conventions, picturing, is the way he shows Descartes in this particular, I think it's a engraving or a woodcut. It's kind of crude, so it might be a woodcut. The way he shows Descartes, Descartes has a look on him that we would now describe in ordinary English as shifty-eyed. And why Van Schooten would want to do that? So what I conclude is that if you look like that in 16, whatever it was, when Van Schooten made the picture, that didn't look shifty-eyed.
Well.
Right, so the last question of the evening, Cynthia Powell.
Yes, I'll take down my hand. Thank you. Thank you all. This was really fascinating. I did want to mention, in line with Robert Adams' comment, that there were also model books in the Middle Ages, and who knows, perhaps in Rome also, and Greece, who knows? In fact, I think so, in Rome, at least. In the history of Roman drawing, I believe there were also model books used for the use of artists, of other artists. So there was a kind of community in that area too. And then stained glass in the churches and probably other buildings, in fact, in other buildings also, even before printing, well before printing, of course. Now, the other thing that I've been wondering about, I'm working a great deal on a manuscript, which I published 40 years ago in the Vatican, which was made for Ludovico Gonzaga of Mantua in 1460 by Pier Candido de Cembrio, a humanist who got interested in some natural history texts written by Thomas de Contempre of the 13th century. The illustrations were added, they were requested actually by Ludovico, and in 1460, they were not added until the end of the 16th and maybe the 17th, I'm now thinking, century, by perhaps someone associated with Mantua, and perhaps he was in touch with other people other artists and naturalists who were in fact from the lowlands, from Antwerp. All of this happened because Ludovico in 1460 asked de Cembrio to have his manuscript of the natural history chapters based on Thomas of Contempre, to have a fine master make images for the bottoms of the folio, make a fine copy made with the bottoms of the folios left blank so that images could be made by a fine artist so that he could better understand the text. This is an extraordinary request, I think, for that time, 1460. This happened. The manuscript was made and copied and corrected by de Cembrio, the author, in his own hand. and it wasn't illustrated until at least 130 years later. That is quite clear. The illustrations were based on the printed works, largely on printed works of Conrad Gessner of Zurich. And the illustrations I am now finding, are also partly based on the works of the Hoefnagels of Antwerp. This means that, and the Hoefnagels are an interesting father and son. The father, Joris Hoefnagel, was an engraver. Was a naturalist artist who made phenomenally beautiful insect and other animal illustrations. And the son was an engraver and a painter also, but he was an engraver who copied these images into printed works. So that does sustain your argument, Brian, very, very clearly. In fact, I'm going to mention you now that I see that you're talking about all this. And I wonder more about this book of yours that's been talked about. Anyway, the other possible artists involved in this manuscript were another father and son of brothers. I'm sorry. The older brother was Giorgio Gysi of Mantua, and he was a very famous engraver who in fact diffused the images of Raphael, Michelangelo, and other great artists, and was very famous in his own lifetime. His younger brother, who was 16 years younger, that's why I think of him as his son, then participated in some of his Gysi's work and drew the models, and was also a naturalist, and may have been in touch with these Hoefnagels. In fact, had to have been probably in touch with these Hoefnagels. So the whole thing is really embodied in the manuscript that I work on. On the other hand, I do think that you have to think about the model books that I mentioned, and the stained glass and the sculpture that Robert Adams mentioned. And I'm wondering why you avoid the word images.
I avoid the word images because I want to emphasize the word picture. Because image in English is a little more abstract than the word picture is.
But it includes.
I don't think it amounts to very much, quite frankly.
What, images?
No. I mean, if once in a while I said image instead of picture, I don't think it would amount to very much. Sometimes it makes sense.
Images can be.
The idea of imaging, the participle picturing is pretty important in the account that I give, kind of parallel to visualizing. And imaging has different connotations, particularly philosophically, because it's connected with the faculty of imagination. In the Meditations, Descartes has lots and lots and lots of things to say about imaginatio. He has very little to say about pictura, and that distinction is quite important. There's lots in the book you'll be glad to know about the Hoefnagel, father and son, about Joris and Jakob, and there's also quite a lot about Conrad Gessner. I said we didn't have time to mention it today.
Mm-hmm. And what about model books? I mean, images can be.
Model books, like the question about patents. It's a very good question. The model books don't qualify for the optic experience because they're not made by a technology. And the reason that's important is because there can't be 1,000 exact duplicates of a model book in the way that there can be 1,000 exact copies of Descartes' tennis player. That's the difference.
Well, printing.
The great theoretical explanation of this isn't, by me, it's not original, it's by Walter Benjamin. The famous essay that he published in the middle 30s. With mechanical reproduction of art. The key thing is that you can make thousands of exact copies. That's the key thing.
No, they're not exact. Excuse me. I mean, okay, there are subtle differences among copies.
That's not a subtle difference.
But-
That's a real transforming difference.
Anyway, yeah, well, and the printed things are used as models for artists. I think you're wrong about the models being not, I mean, they could be called a technology, the model books. I mean, the artists who used them in the Middle Ages copied from them. Of course, nothing is an exact copy of anything, but
In the book, I take some trouble to explain, as I should have today, that what I mean by a technology is something that produces something else with machinery. That's what I mean by a technology.
something that produces something else, what, Lee?
With machinery.
With machinery. Okay, I see. Well, a pen?
No.
Okay, I think those are all the questions we have. Dan, do you want to wrap this up at your end?
I'm not sure that there's anything to say to wrap things up. Thank you all for your patience.
Indeed. Thank you very, very much.
This has been, I think, a really interesting session. Thank you to Brian and to Calvin and to all of the audience. And we have another session on Tuesday as normal, 1 o'clock Princeton time, 7 o'clock Bucharest time, I think.
I think it's 8 now. Yeah.
8 o'clock Bucharest time on Hume. And we hope to see many of you there. But thank you very, very much.
Thank you all again.
Right. Yes. Good. Okay. Leave.